The Clue by Carolyn Wells. Chapter 1. The Van Normans. The old Van Norman mansion was the finest house in Mapleton. Well back from the road, it sat proudly among its finely kept lawns and gardens, as if with a dignified sense of its own importance, and its white colonial columns gleamed through the trees, like sentinels guarding the entrance to the stately hall. All Mapleton was proud of the picturesque old place, and it was shown to visiting strangers with the same pride that the native villagers pointed out the Memorial Library and the new church. More than a half-century old, the patrician white house seemed to glance coldly on the upstart cottages, whose inadequate pillars supporting beetling second stories, and whose spacious filigreed verandas left woefully small area for rooms inside the house. The Van Norman mansion was not like that. It was a long rectangle, and each of its 4 stories was a series of commodious, well-shaped apartments, and its owner, the beautiful Madeleine Van Norman, was the most envied as well as the most admired young woman in the town. Magnificent Madeleine, as she was sometimes called, was of the haughty, imperious type, which inspires admiration and respect rather than love. An orphan and an heiress, she had lived all of her 22 years of life in the old house, and since the death of her uncle, 2 years before, had continued as mistress of the place, ably assisted by a pleasant, motherly chaperon, a clever social secretary, and a corps of capable servants. The mansion itself and an income amply sufficient to maintain it were already legally her own, but by the terms of her uncle's will she was soon to come into possession of the bulk of the great fortune he had left. Madeleine was the only living descendant of old Richard Van Norman, save for one distant cousin, a young man of a scapegrace and ne'er-do-well sort, who of late years had lived abroad. This young man's early life had been spent in Mapleton, but his fiery temper having brought about a serious quarrel with his uncle, he had wisely concluded to take himself out of the way. And yet Tom Willard was not of a quarrelsome disposition. His bad temper was of the impulsive sort, roused suddenly, and as quickly suppressed. Nor was it often in evidence. Good-natured, easy-going Tom would put up with his uncle's criticism and fault-finding for weeks at a time, and then, perhaps goaded beyond endurance, he would fly into a rage and express himself in fluent, if rather vigorous, English. For Richard Van Norman had been by no means an easy man to live with, and it was Tom's general amiability that had made him the usual scapegoat for his uncle's ill temper. Miss Madeleine would have none of it. Quite as dictatorial as the old man himself, she allowed no interference with her own plans and no criticism of her own actions. This had proved the right way to manage Mr. Van Norman, and he had always acceded to Madeleine's requests or submitted to her decrees without objection, though there had never been any demonstration of affection between the two. But demonstration was quite foreign to the nature of both uncle and niece, and in truth they were really fond of each other in their quiet, reserved way. Tom Willard was different. His affection was of the honest and outspoken sort, and he made friends easily, though he often lost them with equal rapidity. On account, then, of his devotion to Madeleine and his enmity toward young Tom Willard, Richard Van Norman had willed the old place to his niece, and had further directed that the whole of his large fortune should be unrestrictedly bestowed upon her on her wedding day, or on her 23rd birthday, should she reach that age unmarried. In event of her death before her marriage, and also before her 23rd birthday, the whole estate would go to Tom Willard. It was with the greatest reluctance that Richard Van Norman decreed this, but a provision had to be made in case of Madeleine's early death, and Willard was the only other natural heir. And now, at 22, Madeleine was on the eve of marriage to Schuyler Carleton, a member of one of the oldest and best families of Mapleton. The village gossips were pleased to commend this union, as Mr. Carleton was a man of irreproachable habits, and handsome enough to appear well beside the magnificent Madeleine. He was not a rich man, but as her marriage would bring her inheritance, they could rank among the millionaires of the day. Yet there were those who feared for the future happiness of this apparently ideal couple. Mrs. Markham, who was both housekeeper and chaperon to her young charge, mourned in secret over the attitude of the betrothed pair. "He adores her, I'm sure," she said to herself, "but he is too courtly and polished in his manner. I'd rather he would impulsively caress her, or involuntarily call her by some endearing name, than to be always so exquisitely deferential and polite. And Madeleine must love him, or why should she marry him? Yet she is so haughty and formal, she might be a very duchess instead of a young American girl. But that's Madeleine all over. I've never seen her exhibit any real emotion over anything. Ah, well, I'm an old-fashioned fool. Doubtless they're cooing doves when alone together, but their high-bred notions won't allow any sentiment shown before other people. But I almost wish she were going to marry Tom. He has sentiment and enthusiasm enough for two, and the relationship is so distant it's not worth thinking about. Dear old Tom! He's the only one who ever stirs Madeleine out of that dignified calm of hers." And that was true enough. Madeleine had inherited the Van Norman traits of dignity and reserve to such an extent that it was difficult for any one to be a really close friend. She had, too, a strange little air of preoccupation, and even when interested in a conversation, would appear to look through or beyond her companion in a way that was discouraging to the average caller. So Miss Van Norman was by no means a favorite with the Mapleton young people on a personal sense, but socially she was their leader, and to be on her invitation list was the highest aspiration of the village climbers. And now that she was about to marry Schuyler Carleton, the event of the wedding was the only thing talked of, thought of, or dreamed of by Mapleton society. Madeleine, who always kept in touch with Tom Willard by correspondence, had written him of her approaching marriage, and he had responded by coming at once to America to attend the ceremony. Relieved from the embarrassment of his uncle's presence, Tom was his jovial self, and showed forth all the reprehensible attractiveness which so often belongs to the scapegrace nature. He sometimes quarreled with Madeleine over trifles, then, making up next minute, he would caress and pet her with the privileged air of a relative. He was glad to be back among the familiar scenes of Mapleton, and he went about the town renewing old acquaintances and making new ones, and charming all by his winning personality. In less than a week he had more friends in the village than Schuyler Carleton had ever made. Carleton, though handsome and distinguished looking, was absolutely without personal magnetism or charm, which traits were found in abundance in Tom Willard. The friends of Schuyler Carleton attributed his reserved, almost repellent demeanor to shyness, and this was partly true. His acquaintances said it was indifference, and this again was partly true. Then his enemies, of which he had some, vowed that his cold, curt manner of speech was merely snobbishness, and this was not true at all. His manner toward his fiancée was all that the most exacting could require in the matter of courtesy and punctilious politeness. He was markedly undemonstrative in public, and if this were true of his behavior when the two were alone, it was probably because Madeleine herself neither inspired nor desired terms or acts of endearment. Tom's attitude toward Madeleine angered Carleton extremely, but when he spoke to her on the subject, he was gaily informed that the matter of cousinly affection was outside the jurisdiction of a fiancé. Tom, on his part, was desperately in love with Madeleine, and had been for years. Repeatedly he had begged her to marry him, and she knew in her heart that his plea was prompted by his love for herself, and not by any consideration of her fortune. And yet, should she marry another, all hope of his uncle's money would be forever lost to Tom Willard. But, prodigal and spendthrift that he was, if Tom felt any regret at his vanishing fortunes, he showed no sign of it. Save for sudden and often easily provoked bursts of temper, he was infectiously gay and merry, and was the life of the house party already gathered under Madeleine's roof. The fact that Tom was staying at the Van Norman house, which of course Carleton could not do, gave Willard advantage over the prospective bridegroom, of which he was by no means unconscious. Partly to tease the imperturbable but jealous Carleton, and partly because of his own affection for his cousin, Tom devoted himself assiduously to Madeleine, especially when Carleton was present. "You see, Maddy," Tom would say, "there are only a few days left of our boy and girl chumminess. I fancy that after you are married, Schuyler won't let me speak to you, save in most formal terms, so I must see all I can of you now." Then he would tuck her arm through his own and take her for a stroll in the grounds, and Carleton, coming to search for her, would find them cosily chatting in a secluded arbor, or drifting lazily in a canoe on the tiny, lily-padded lake. These things greatly annoyed Schuyler Carleton, but remonstrance was never an easy task for him, nor did it ever affect Madeleine pleasantly. "I wish, Madeleine," he had said one day, when he had waited 2 hours for her to return from a drive with Tom, "that you would have a little regard for appearances, if you have none for my wishes. It is not seemly for my betrothed wife to be driving all over the country with another man." Magnificent Madeleine looked straight at him, tilting her head back slightly to look beneath her half-closed lids. "It is not seemly," she said, "for my betrothed husband to imply that I could be at fault in a matter of propriety or punctilio. That is not possible." "You are right," he said, and his eyes gleamed with admiration of her glorious beauty and imperious manner. "Forgive me, you are indeed right." Though Schuyler Carleton may not have been lavish of affection, he begrudged no admiration to the splendid woman he had won. And yet, had he but known it, the apparently scornful and haughty girl was craving a more tender and gentle love, and would gladly have foregone his admiration to have received more affection. "But it will come," Madeleine thought to herself. "I am not of the clinging vine type, I know. But after we are married, surely Schuyler will be less formally polite and more, well, chummy." Yet Madeleine herself was chummy with nobody save Tom. They two were always chatting and laughing together, and though they differed sometimes, and even quarreled, it was quickly made up, and forgotten in a new subject of merry discussion. But, after all, they rarely quarreled except regarding Madeleine's approaching marriage. "Don't throw yourself away on that iceberg, Maddy," Tom would plead. He's a truly fine man, I know, but he can't make you happy." "How absurd you are, Tom! Give me credit, please, for knowing my own mind at least. I love Schuyler Carleton, and I am proud that he is to be my husband. He is the finest man I have ever known in every way, and I am a fortunate girl to be chosen by such a man." "Oh, Maddy, don't do the humble. It doesn't suit you at all. You are the type who ought to have kings and crown princes at your feet, and Carleton is princely enough in his effects, but he's by no means at your feet." "What do you mean?" exclaimed Madeleine angrily. "Just what I say. Schuyler Carleton admires you greatly, but he doesn't love you, at least not as I do." "Don't be foolish, Tom. Naturally, you know nothing about Mr. Carleton's affection for me. He does not proclaim it from the housetops, and I desire you not to speak of it again." "Why should I speak of what doesn't exist? Forgive me, Maddy, but I love you so myself, it drives me frantic to see that man treating you so coolly." "He doesn't treat me coolly, or if he does, it's because I don't wish for tender demonstrations before other people. I'm fond of you, Tom, as you know, but I won't allow even you to criticize the man I am about to marry." "Oh, very well, marry him then, and a precious unhappy life you'll lead with him, and I know why." Madeleine turned on him, her eyes blazing with anger. "What do you mean? Explain that last remark of yours." "Small need. You know why as well as I do," and Tom pushed his hands into his pockets and strode away, whistling, well knowing that he had roused his cousin's even temper at last. In addition to some of her Mapleton friends, Madeleine had invited 2 girls from New York to be her bridesmaids. Kitty French and Molly Gardner had already come and were staying at the Van Norman house the few days that would intervene before the wedding. Knowing Madeleine well as they did, they had not expected confidence from her, nor did they look forward to cozy romantic boudoir chats, such as many girls would enjoy. But neither had they expected the peculiar constraint that seemed to hang over all the members of the household. Mrs. Markham had been so long housekeeper and even companion for Madeleine that she was not looked upon as a servant, and to her Kitty French put a few discreet questions regarding the exceeding reserve of Mr. Carleton. "I don't know, Miss French," said the good woman, looking sadly disturbed. "I love Madeleine as I would my own child. I know she adores Mr. Carleton, and, yes, I know he greatly admires her. And yet there is something wrong. I can't express it, it's merely a feeling, an intuition, but there is something wrong." "You know Mr. Willard is in love with Maddy," suggested Miss French. "Oh, it isn't that. They've always had a cousinly affection for each other, and, yes, Tom is in love with her. But what I mean is aside from all that. The real reason that Madeleine flirts with Tom, for she does flirt with him, is to pique Mr. Carleton. There, I've said more than I meant to, but you're too good a friend to let it make any trouble, and, anyway, in a few days they will be married, and then I'm sure it'll be all right. I'm sure of it." Like many people, Mrs. Markham emphasized by repetition a statement of whose truth she was far from sure. Chapter 2. Miss Morton Arrives. The day before the wedding the old house was a pleasant scene of bustle and confusion. Professional decorators were in charge of the great drawing room, building a canopy of green vines and flowers, beneath which the bridal pair should stand the next day at high noon. This work was greatly hindered by a bevy of young people who thought they were helping. At last, noting a look of dumb exasperation on the face of one of the florist's men, Molly Gardner exclaimed, "I don't believe our help is needed here. Come on, Kitty. Let's go in the library and wait for tea time." It was nearly 5 o'clock, and the girls found most of the house guests already assembled in the library, awaiting the arrival of the tea tray. Several other young people were there also, most of them being those who were to be of the wedding cortege next day. Robert Fessenden, who was to be best man, had just come from New York and had dropped in to see Miss Van Norman. Although he was an old friend of Carleton's, Madeleine did not know him very well, and though she made him welcome, it was with that coldly formal air that did not greatly attract the young man, but he could not fail to be impressed by her great beauty. "Lucky fellow, Carleton," he said to Tom Willard. "Why, that woman would create a sensation in any great city in the world." "Yes, she is too handsome to live all her life in a small village," agreed Tom. "I think they intend to travel a great deal. An heiress, too, I believe. Yes, she has all the desirable traits a woman can possess." "All?" Fessenden's tone was quizzical. "What do you mean?" asked Tom sharply. "Nothing. Only, if I were to marry, I should prefer a little more softness of nature." "Oh, that's only her manner. My cousin is most sweet and womanly, I assure you." "I'm sure she is," returned Fessenden, who was a bit ashamed of his outspokenness. "And she's getting a sterling good fellow for a husband." "She is so," said Tom heartily, which was kind of him, considering his own opinion of Carleton. And then both men strolled over to where Madeleine sat at the tea table. She was reading a telegram that had just been brought to her, and she laughingly explained to Tom that it meant a bother for him. "Miss Morton has concluded to come to the wedding after all," she said. "She wrote me that she wouldn't come, but she has changed her mind, it seems. Now, it does sound ridiculous, I know, but in this big house there isn't a room left for her but the one you have, Tom. You see, one bedroom is used for a present room, one is reserved for Schuyler to-morrow, the bridesmaids have another, and except for our own rooms, and those already occupied by guests, there are no more. I hate to ask you, Tom, but could you go to the inn?" "Sure, Maddy dear. Anything to oblige. But it does seem too bad to turn me out of your house the very last day that your hospitality is all your own to offer. To-morrow the Grand Seigneur will be master here, and my timid little Madeleine can no longer call her soul her own." This reference to the tall and stately mistress of the house raised a general laugh, but Madeleine did not join in it. "I'm so sorry, Tom," she said earnestly, as she looked again at the telegram she was holding, "but Miss Morton was an old friend of Uncle Richard's, and as she wants to come here, I can't turn her away. And unless you give her your room, there is no other—" "Nonsense, Madeleine, I'm only joking. Of course I'll go to the hotel. Only too glad to accommodate Miss Morton. Forget it, girl. I assure you I don't mind a bit. I'll pack up a few traps after dinner and skip down to the picturesque, if rather ostentatious, Mapleton Inn." As Tom spoke he put his arm carelessly round Madeleine's shoulders, and though scarcely more than a cousinly caress, it was unfortunate that Schuyler Carleton should enter the room at that moment. a lightning glance flashed between the two men, and as Tom moved away from Madeleine, with a slightly embarrassed shrug of his shoulders, Carleton's face grew so stern that an uncomfortable silence fell upon the guests. However, the arrival of the tea tray saved the situation, and Madeleine at once busied herself in the pretty occupation of serving tea to her guests. With an air of jealous proprietorship, Carleton moved toward her and, looking handsome, though sulky, stood by Willard with folded arms, as if on guard. Urged on by a daredevil spirit of mischief, and perhaps remembering that Madeleine would soon be beyond his reach as Carleton's wife, Tom also moved toward her from the other side. Endeavoring to treat the situation lightly, Madeleine held up a newly filled teacup. "Who will have this?" she asked gaily. "I will," declared Carleton and Tom at the same time, and each held out a hand. Madeleine looked at them both, smilingly. Carleton's face was white and set. He was evidently making a serious matter of the trifling episode. Tom, on the contrary, was smiling broadly, and was quite evidently enjoying his rival's discomfiture. "I shall give it to you, because you look so pleasant," declared Madeleine, handing the cup to Tom. "Now, Schuyler, smile prettily, and you may have one too." But Carleton would not fall in with her light mood. Bending a little, he said in a tense voice, "I will leave you to your cousin now. To-morrow I shall assert my claim." Though not rude in themselves, the words were accompanied by a harsh and disdainful glance that made several of the onlookers wonder what sort of a life the haughty Madeleine would lead with such a coldly tyrannical husband. "The brute!" said Tom under his breath, as Carleton left the room. "Never mind, Maddy. The old Turk has left you to me for this evening, and we'll take him at his word." Suddenly Madeleine's mood changed to one of utter gaiety. She smiled impartially on all, she jested with the girls, she bewitched the young men with her merry banter, and she almost seemed to be flirting with Tom Willard. But he was her cousin, after all, and much is forgiven a bride-to-be on her wedding eve. Robert Fessenden looked at Miss Van Norman with a puzzled air. He couldn't seem to understand her, and was glad when, by chance, the two were left comparatively alone for a few moments' conversation. "A great responsibility devolves on the best man, Miss Van Norman," he said in response to a chaffing remark of hers. "I suppose that to-morrow I shall be General Director-in-Chief, and if anything should go wrong, I shall be blamed." "But nothing will go wrong," said Madeleine gaily. "And then think how you'll be praised." "Ah, but you won't be here to hear the praise heaped upon me, so what's the use?" "No, I shall be gone forever," said Madeleine, putting on one of her far-away looks. "I never want to come back to Mapleton. I hate it." "Why, Miss Van Norman! You want to desert this beautiful old house? Schuyler can never find you a home so comfortable and attractive in every way." "I don't care. I want to go far away from Mapleton to live. We're going to travel for a year, anyway, but when we do settle down, it will be abroad, I hope." "You surprise me. Schuyler didn't tell me this. We've been chums so long that I usually know of his plans. But, of course, getting married changes all that." "You're a very intimate friend of Mr. Carleton's, aren't you?" said Madeleine, with a strange note of wistfulness in her voice. "Yes, I am. Why?" "Oh, nothing. I only thought—I mean, do you think—" Rob Fessenden was thrilled by the plaintive expression on the beautiful face, and suddenly felt a great desire to help this girl, who was seemingly so far above and beyond all need of help, and yet was surely about to ask his aid, or at least his sympathy. "Don't hesitate," he said gently. "What is it, Miss Van Norman? I want to be as firm a friend of yours as I am of Schuyler's, so please say what you wish to." I can't," Madeleine whispered, and her voice was almost a moan. "Please," again urged Fessenden. "Do you know Dorothy Burt?" Madeleine then broke out, as if the words were fairly forced from her. "No," said Fessenden, amazed. "I never heard the name before. Who is she?" "Hush! She's nobody, less than nobody. Don't mention her to me ever again, nor to anyone else. Ah, here comes Miss Morton." As Fessenden watched Madeleine, she changed swiftly from a perturbed, troubled girl to a courteous, polished hostess. "My dear Miss Morton," she said, advancing to meet her newest guest, "how kind of you to come to me at this time." "I didn't come exactly out of kindness," said Miss Morton, "but because I desired to come. I hope you are quite well. Will you give me some tea?" Miss Morton was a tall, angular lady, with gray hair and sharp, black eyes. She seemed to bite off her words at the ends of her short sentences, and had a brisk, alert manner that was, in a way, aggressive. "An eccentric," Rob Fessenden thought, as he looked at her and wondered why she was there at all. "An old sweetheart of Mr. Richard Van Norman, I believe," said Kitty French when he questioned her. "They were once engaged, and then quarreled and broke it off, and neither of them lived happily ever after." "As the Carletons will," said Fessenden, smiling. "Yes," said Kitty slowly, "as the Carletons will, I hope. You know Mr. Carleton awfully well, don't you? Are you sure he will make our Maddy happy, Mr. Fessenden?" "I think so," and Fessenden tried to speak casually. "He is not an emotional man, or one greatly given to sentiment, but I judge she is not that sort either." "Oh, yes, she is. Maddy is apparently cold and cynical, but she isn't really so a bit. But she perfectly adores him, and if they're not happy, it won't be her fault." "Nor will it be his," said Fessenden, warmly defending his absent friend. "Carleton's an old trump. There's no finer man in the world, and any woman ought to be happy with him." "I'm glad to hear you say that," said Kitty with a little sigh of relief. "Do look at that funny Miss Morton. She seems to be scolding Madeleine. I'm sorry she came. She doesn't seem very attractive. But perhaps it's because she was crossed in love, and it made her queer." "Or she was queered in love, and it made her cross," laughed Fessenden. "Well, I must go now and look up Carleton. Poor old boy, he was a little miffed when he went away." After tea, all the callers departed, and those who were house guests went to their rooms to dress for dinner. Tom Willard, with great show of burlesque regret and tearful farewells, went to the hotel, that Miss Morton might have the room he had been occupying. He promised to return for dinner, and gaily blew kisses to Madeleine as with his traps he was driven down the avenue. At dinner, Schuyler Carleton's place was vacant. It had been arranged next to Madeleine's, and when 15 minutes after the dinner hour he had not arrived, she haughtily accepted Tom Willard's arm and led the way to the dining room. But having reached the table, she directed Tom to take his rightful seat, at some distance from her own, and Carleton's chair remained empty at Madeleine's side. At first this was uncomfortably evident, but Madeleine was in gay spirits, and soon the whole party followed her lead, and the conversation was general and in a merry key. The young hostess had never looked more regally beautiful. Her dark hair, piled high on her head, was adorned with a dainty ornament which, though only a twisted ribbon, was shaped like a crown, and gave her the effect of an imperious queen. Her low-cut gown of pale yellow satin was severe of line and accented her stately bearing, while her exquisitely modeled neck and shoulders were as white and pure as those of a marble statue. Save for a double row of pearls around her throat, she wore no ornaments, but on the morrow Carleton's gift of magnificent diamonds would grace her bridal costume. The combination of haughty imperial beauty and a dazzling witchery of mood was irresistible, and the men and girls alike realized that never before had Madeleine seemed so wonderful. After the dessert was placed on the table, Willard could stand it no longer, and leaving his own place, he calmly appropriated Carleton's vacant chair. Madeleine did not reprove him, and Kitty French took occasion to whisper to her neighbor, "'Twere better by far to have matched our fair cousin to brave Lochinvar." Mrs. Markham overheard the quotation, and a look of pain came into her eyes. But it was all too late now, and tomorrow Madeleine would be irrevocably Schuyler Carleton's wife. After dinner, coffee was served in the cozy library. Madeleine preferred this room to the more elaborately furnished drawing-room, and tonight her word was law. But suddenly her mood changed. For no apparent reason, her gay spirits vanished. Her smile faded away, and a pathetic droop curved the corners of her beautiful mouth. At about 10 o'clock she said abruptly, though gently, "I wish you'd all go to bed. Unless you girls get some beauty sleep, you won't look pretty at my wedding tomorrow." "I'm quite ready to go," declared Kitty French with some tact, for she saw that Madeleine was nervous and strung up to a high tension. "I, too," exclaimed Molly Gardner, and the two girls said good night and went upstairs. 2 or 3 young men who had been dinner guests also made their adieux, and Tom Willard said, "Well, I may as well toddle to my comforts of home, as understood by a country innkeeper." Madeleine said good night to him kindly enough, but without jest or gaiety. Tom looked at her curiously for a moment, and then, gently kissing her hand, he went away. Mrs. Markham, having seen Miss Morton comfortably installed in what had been Tom's room, returned to the library to offer her services to Madeleine. But the girl only thanked her, saying, "There is nothing you can do to-night. I want to be alone for an hour or two. I will stay here in the library for a time, and I'd like to have you send Cicely to me." A few moments later Cicely Dupuy came in, bringing some letters and papers. She was Miss Van Norman's private secretary, and admirably did she fill the post. Quick-witted, clever, deft of hand and brain, she answered notes, kept accounts, and in many ways made herself invaluable to her employer. Moreover, Madeleine liked her. Cicely was of a charming personality. Small, fair, with big childish blue eyes and a rose-leaf skin, she was a pretty picture to look at. "Sit down," said Madeleine, and make a little list of some final matters I want you to attend to tomorrow." Cicely sat down, and taking pencil and tablet from the library table, made the lists as Madeleine directed. This occupied but a short time, and then Miss Van Norman said wearily, "You may go now, Cicely. Go to bed at once, dear. You will have much to do tomorrow. And please tell Marie I shall not need her services tonight. She may go to her room. I shall sit here for an hour or more, and I will answer these notes. I wish to be alone." "Very well, Miss Van Norman," said Cicely, and taking the list she had made, she went softly from the room. Chapter 3. A Cry in the Night. "Help!" The loud cry of a single word was not repeated, but repetition was unnecessary, for the sound rang through the old Van Norman house and carried its message of fear and horror to all, awake or sleeping, within its walls. It was about 11:30 that same night, and Cicely Dupuy, still fully dressed, flew from her bedroom out into the hall. Seeing a light downstairs and hearing the servants' bells, one after another, as if rung by a frantic hand, she hesitated a moment only, and then ran downstairs. In the lower hall, Schuyler Carleton, with a dazed expression on his white, drawn face, was uncertainly pushing various electric buttons which, in turn, flashed lights on or off, or rang bells in distant parts of the house. For a moment Cicely stared straight at the man. Their eyes met, their gaze seemed to concentrate, and they stood motionless, as if spellbound. This crisis was broken in upon by Marie, Madeleine's French maid, who came running downstairs in a hastily donned negligée. "Mon Dieu!" she cried. "Où est mademoiselle?" With a start, Carleton turned from Cicely, and still with that dazed look on his face, he motioned Marie toward the wide doorway of the library. The girl took a step toward the threshold, and then, with a shriek, paused, and ventured no further. Cicely, as if impelled by an unseen force, slowly turned and followed Marie's movements, and as the girl screamed, Cicely grasped her tightly by the arm, and the two stood staring in at the library door. What they saw was Madeleine Van Norman, seated in a chair at the library table. Her right arm was on the table, and her head, which had fallen to one side, was supported by her right shoulder. Her eyes were partly closed, and her lips were parted, and the position of the rigid figure left no need for further evidence that this was not a natural sleep. But further evidence there was. Miss Van Norman still wore her yellow satin gown, but the beautiful embroidered bodice was stained a dull red, and a crimson stream was even then spreading its way down the shimmering breadths of the trailing skirt. On the table, near the outstretched white hand, lay a Venetian dagger. This dagger was well known to the onlookers. It had lain on the library table for many years, and though ostensibly for the purpose of a paper cutter, it was rarely used as such. Its edges were too sharp to cut paper satisfactorily, and, moreover, it was a wicked-looking affair, and many people had shuddered as they touched it. It had a history, too, and Richard Van Norman used to tell his guests of dark deeds in which the dagger had taken part while it was still in Italy. Madeleine herself had had a horror of the weapon, though she had often admitted the fascination of its marvelous workmanship, and had said upon several occasions that the thing fairly hypnotized her, and some day she should kill herself, or somebody else, with it. From an instinctive sense of duty, Marie started forward, as if to help her mistress. Then, with a convulsive shudder, she screamed again and clasped her hands before her eyes to shut out the awful sight. Cicely, too, moved slowly toward the silent figure, then turned and again gazed steadfastly at Schuyler Carleton. There must have been interrogation in her eyes, for the man pointed toward the table, and Cicely looked again, to notice there a bit of paper with writing on it. She made no motion toward it, but the expression on her face changed to one of bewildered surprise. Before she had time to speak, however, the other people of the house all at once began to gather in the hall. Mrs. Markham came first, and though when she saw Madeleine she turned very white and seemed about to faint, she bravely went at once toward the girl and gently tried to raise the fallen head. She felt a firm grasp on her shoulder and turned to see Miss Morton, with a stern, set face, at her side. "Don't touch her," said Miss Morton in a whisper. "Telephone for a doctor quickly." "But she's dead," declared Mrs. Markham, at the same time bursting into violent sobs. "We do not know. We hope not," went on Miss Morton, and without another word she led Mrs. Markham to a sofa, and sat her down rather suddenly, and then went herself straight to the telephone. As she reached it, she paused only to inquire the name of the family physician. Harris, the butler, with difficulty articulated the name of Dr. Hills and his telephone number, and without further inquiry Miss Morton called for him. "Is this Dr. Hills?" she said when her call was answered. "Yes, this is the Van Norman house. Come here at once. No matter, you must come at once. It is very important, a matter of life and death. I am Miss Morton. I am in charge here. Yes, come immediately. Good-bye." Miss Morton hung up the receiver and turned to the frightened group of servants. "You can do nothing," she said, "and you may as well return to your rooms. Harris may stay, and one of the parlor maids." Miss Morton had an imperious air, and instinctively the servants obeyed her. But Cicely Dupuy was not so ready to accept the dictum of a stranger. She stepped forward and, facing Miss Morton, said quietly, "Mrs. Markham is housekeeper as well as Miss Van Norman's chaperon. The servants are accustomed to take their orders from her." Miss Morton returned Cicely's direct gaze. "You see, Mrs. Markham," she said, pointing to the sofa, where that lady had entirely collapsed, and, with her head in a pillow, was shaking with convulsive sobs, "she is for the moment quite incapable of giving orders. As the oldest person present, and as a lifelong friend of Mr. Richard Van Norman, I shall take the liberty of directing affairs in the present crisis." Then, in a softer tone, and with a glance toward Madeleine, Miss Morton continued, "I trust, in view of the awfulness of the occasion, you will give me your sympathy and cooperation, that we may work in harmony." Cicely gave Miss Morton a curious glance that might have meant almost anything, but with a slight inclination of her head, she said only, "Yes, madam." Then Kitty French and Molly Gardner came downstairs and stood trembling on the threshold. "What is it?" whispered Kitty. "What's the matter with Madeleine?" "Something dreadful has happened," said Miss Morton, meeting them at the door. "I have telephoned for Dr. Hills, and he will be here soon. Until then we can do nothing." "But we can try to help Maddy," exclaimed Kitty, starting toward the still figure by the table. "Oh, is she hurt? I thought she had fainted." As the two girls saw the dread sight, Miss Gardner fainted herself, and Miss Morton bade Marie, who stood shivering in the hall, take care of her. Relieved at having something to do, Marie shook the girl and dashed water in her face until she regained consciousness, the others meanwhile paying little attention. Schuyler Carleton stood leaning against the door-post, his eyes fixed on Madeleine's tragic figure, while Kitty French, who had dropped into a chair, sat with her hands tightly clasped, also gazing at the sad picture. Although it seemed hours to those who awaited him, it was but a few moments before the doctor came. Dr. Hills was a clean-cut, alert-looking young man, and his quick eyes seemed to take in every detail of the scene at a glance. He went straight to the girl at the table and bent over her. Only the briefest examination was necessary before he said gently, "She is quite dead. She has been stabbed with this dagger. It entered a large blood vessel just over her heart, and she bled to death. Who killed her?" Even as he spoke, his eye fell on the written paper which lay on the table. With one of his habitually quick gestures, he snatched it up and read it to himself, while a look of great surprise dawned on his face. Immediately he read it aloud. "I am wholly miserable, and unless the clouds lift, I must end my life. I love S., but he does not love me." After he finished reading, Dr. Hills stood staring at the paper and looked utterly perplexed. "I should have said it was not a suicide," he declared, "but this message seems to indicate that it is. Is this written in Miss Van Norman's hand?" Miss Morton, who stood at the doctor's side, took the paper and scrutinized it. "It is," she said. "Yes, certainly that is Miss Van Norman's writing. I had a letter from her only a few days ago, and I recognize it perfectly." "Let me see it," said Mrs. Markham, in a determined, though rather timid way. "I am more familiar with Madeleine's writing than a stranger can possibly be." Miss Morton handed the paper to the housekeeper without a word, while the doctor, waiting, wondered why these two women seemed so out of sympathy with each other. "Yes, it is surely Madeleine's writing," agreed Mrs. Markham, her glasses dropping off as her eyes filled with tears. "Then I suppose she killed herself, poor girl," said the doctor. "She must have been desperate indeed, for it was a strong blow that drove the steel in so deeply. Who first discovered her here?" "I did," said Schuyler Carleton, stepping forward. His face was almost as white as the dead girl's, and he was scarcely able to make his voice heard. "I came in with a latch key, and found her here, just as you see her now." As Carleton spoke, Cicely Dupuy stared at him with that curious expression that seemed to show something more than grief and horror. Her emotional bewilderment was not surprising in view of the awful situation, but her look was a strange one, and for some reason it greatly disconcerted the man. None of this escaped the notice of Dr. Hills. Looking straight at Carleton, but with a kindly expression replacing the stern look on his face, he went on, "And when you came in, was Miss Van Norman just as we see her now?" "Practically," said Carleton. "I couldn't believe her dead, and I tried to rouse her. Then I saw the dagger on the floor at her feet." "On the floor?" interrupted Dr. Hills. "Yes," replied Carleton, whose agitation was increasing, and who had sunk into a chair because of sheer inability to stand. "It was on the floor at her feet, right at her feet. I picked it up, and there was blood on it. There is blood on it, and I laid it on the table. And then I saw the paper that says she killed herself. And then I turned on the lights and rang the servants' bells. And Cicely, Miss Dupuy, came, and the others, and that's all." Schuyler Carleton had with difficulty concluded his narration, and he sat clenching his hands and biting his lips, as if at the very limit of his powers of endurance. Dr. Hills again glanced round the assembly in that quick way of his, and said, "Did any of you have reason to think Miss Van Norman had any thoughts of taking her own life?" For a moment no one spoke, and then Kitty French, who in a despairing, miserable way was huddled in the depths of a great armchair, said, "I have heard Madeleine say that sometimes she would kill herself with that horrid old dagger. I wish I had stolen it and buried it long ago." Dr. Hills turned to Mrs. Markham. "Did you have any reason to fear this?" he inquired. "No," she replied, "and I do not think Madeleine meant she would voluntarily use that dagger. She only meant she had a superstitious dread of the thing." "Do you understand her references to her own unhappiness in this bit of writing?" went on the doctor. "Yes, I think I do," said Mrs. Markham in a low voice. "That is enough for the present," said the doctor, as if to interrupt further confidences. "Although it is difficult to believe a stab of that nature could be self-inflicted, it is possible, and this communication seems to leave no room for doubt. Now, the law of New Jersey requires that in case of a death not by natural means, the county physician shall be summoned, and further proceedings are entirely at his discretion. I shall therefore be obliged to send for Dr. Leonard before disturbing the body in any way. He will probably not arrive in less than an hour or so, and I would advise that you ladies retire. You can, of course, do nothing to help, and as I shall remain in charge, you may as well get what rest you can during the night." "I thank you for your consideration, Dr. Hills," said Mrs. Markham, who seemed to have recovered her calmness, "but I prefer to stay here. I could not rest after this awful shock, and I cannot stay away from Madeleine." Kitty French and Molly Gardner, who, clasped in each other's arms, were shivering with excitement and grief, begged to be allowed to stay too, but Dr. Hills peremptorily ordered them to go to their rooms. Cicely Dupuy was allowed to stay, as in her position of social secretary she might know much of Madeleine's private affairs. For the same reason Marie was detained, while Dr. Hills asked her a few questions. Schuyler Carleton sat rigidly in his chair, as immovable as a statue. This man puzzled Dr. Hills. And yet it was surely shock enough almost to unhinge a man's brain, thus to find his intended bride the night before his wedding. But Carleton seemed absorbed in emotions other than those of grief. Though his face was impassive, his eyes darted about the room, looking at one after another of the shocked and terrified group, returning always to the still figure at the table, and as quickly turning his gaze away, as if the sight were unbearable, as indeed it was. He seemed like a man stunned with the awfulness of the tragedy, and yet conscious of a care, a responsibility, which he could not shake off. If inadvertently his eyes met those of Miss Dupuy, he shifted his gaze immediately. If by chance he encountered Mrs. Markham's sad glance, he turned away, unable to bear it. In a word, he was like a man at the limit of his endurance, and seemed veritably on the verge of collapse. Chapter 4 Chapter 4. Suicide or— Miss Morton also seemed to have distracting thoughts. She sat down on the sofa beside Mrs. Markham, then she jumped up suddenly and started for the door, only to turn about and resume her seat on the sofa. Here she sat for a few moments, apparently in deep thought. Then she rose and slowly stalked from the room and went upstairs. After a few moments, Marie, the French maid, also rose and silently left the room. Having concluded it was a case for the county physician, Dr. Hills apparently considered that his personal responsibility was at an end, and he sat quietly awaiting the coming of his colleague. After a time, Miss Morton returned, and again took her seat on the sofa. She looked excited and a little flurried, but strove to appear calm. It was a dreadful hour. Only rarely anyone spoke, and though glances sometimes shot from the eyes of one to the eyes of another, each felt his gaze oftenest impelled toward that dread, beautiful figure by the table. At last Schuyler Carleton, with an evident effort, said suddenly, "Oughtn't we to send for Tom Willard?" Mrs. Markham gave a start. "Of course we must," she said. "Poor Tom! He must be told. Who will tell him?" "I will," volunteered Miss Morton, and Dr. Hills looked up, amazed at her calm tone. This woman puzzled him, and he could not understand her continued attempts at authority in a household where she was a comparative stranger. And yet might it not be merely a kind consideration for those who were nearer and dearer to the principals of this awful tragedy? But even as he thought this over, Miss Morton had gone to the telephone, her heavy silk gown rustling as she crossed the room, and her every movement assertive of her own importance. Calling up the Mapleton Inn, she succeeded, after several attempts, in rousing some of its occupants, and finally was in communication with young Willard himself. She did not tell him of the tragedy, but only asked him to come over to the house at once, as something serious had happened, and returned to her seat with a murmured observation that Tom would arrive as soon as possible. Again the little group lapsed into silence. Cicely Dupuy was very nervous, and kept picking at her handkerchief, quite unconscious that she was ruining its delicate lace edge. Dr. Hills glanced furtively from one to another. Many things puzzled him, but most of all he was at a loss to understand the suicide of this beautiful girl on the very eve of her wedding. At last Tom Willard came. Miss Morton met him at the door and took him into the drawing room before he could turn toward the library. Schuyler Carleton's frantic touches on various electric buttons had turned on all the lights in the drawing room. As no one had noticed this, the great apartment had remained illuminated as if for a festivity, and the soft bright lights fell on the floral bower and the elaborate decorations that had been arranged for the wedding day. "What is it?" asked Tom, his own face white with an impending sense of dread as he looked into Miss Morton's eyes. As gently as possible, but in her own straightforward and inevitably somewhat abrupt way, Miss Morton told him. "I want to warn you," she said, "to prepare for a shock, and I think it kinder to tell you the truth at once. Your cousin Madeleine, Miss Van Norman, has taken her own life." "What?" Tom almost shouted the word, and his face showed an absolutely uncomprehending amazement. "She killed herself to-night," Miss Morton went on, whose efforts were now directed toward making the young man understand, rather than toward sparing his feelings. But Tom could not seem to grasp it. "What do you mean?" he said, catching her by both arms. "Madeleine? Killed herself?" "Yes," said Miss Morton, shaken out of her own calm by Tom's excited voice. "In the library, after we had all gone to bed, she stabbed herself with that horrible paper cutter thing. Did you know she was unhappy?" "Unhappy? No, why should she be? To-morrow was to have been her wedding day." "To-day," corrected Miss Morton. "It is already the day on which our dear Madeleine was to have become a bride. And instead," glancing around the brilliant room and at the bridal bower, Miss Morton's composure gave way entirely, and she sobbed hysterically. At this Cicely Dupuy came across from the library. Putting her arm around Miss Morton, she led the sobbing woman away, and without a word to Tom Willard, gave him a glance which seemed to say that he must look out for himself, for her duty was to attend Miss Morton. As the two women left the drawing-room, Tom followed them. He walked slowly, and stared about as if uncertain where to go. He paused a moment midway in the room, and, stooping, picked up some small object from the carpet, which he put in his waistcoat pocket. A moment more, and he had crossed the hall and stood at the library door, gazing at the scene which had already shocked and saddened the others. With a groan, as of utter anguish, Tom involuntarily put up one hand before his eyes. Then, pulling himself together with an effort, he seemed to dash away a tear, and walked into the room, saying almost harshly, "What does it mean?" Doctor Hills rose to meet him, and by way of a brief explanation, he put into Tom's hand the paper he had found on the table. Tom read the written message, and looked more stupefied than ever. With a sudden gesture, he turned towards Schuyler Carleton and said in a low voice, "But you did love her, didn't you?" "I did," replied Carleton simply. "Why should she have thought you didn't?" went on Tom, looking at the paper, and seeming to soliloquize rather than to address his questions to anyone else. As this was the first time that the S in Madeleine's note had been openly assumed to stand for Schuyler Carleton, there was a stir of excitement all around the room. "I don't know," said Carleton, but a dull red flush spread over his white face and his voice trembled. "You don't know!" said Tom in cutting tones. "Man, you must know!" But no reply was made, and dropping into a chair, Tom buried his face in both hands and remained thus for a long time. Tom Willard was a large, stout man, and possessed of the genial and merry demeanor which so often accompanies avoirdupois. Save for his occasional, though really rare, bursts of temper, Tom was always in joking and laughing mood. To see him thus in an agonized, speechless despair deeply affected Mrs. Markham. Tom had always been a favorite with her, and not even Madeleine had regretted more than she the estrangement between Richard Van Norman and his nephew. And even as Mrs. Markham looked at the bowed head of the great strong man, she suddenly bethought herself for the first time that Tom was now heir to the Van Norman fortune. She wondered if he had himself yet realized it, and then she scolded herself for letting such thoughts intrude so unfittingly soon. And yet she well knew that it would not be in ordinary human nature long to ignore the fact of such a sudden change of fortunes. As she looked at Tom, her glance strayed toward Mr. Carleton, and then the thought struck her that what Tom had gained, this man had lost. For had Madeleine lived, the Van Norman money would have been, in a way, at the disposal of her husband. The girl's death then would make Tom a rich man, while Schuyler Carleton would remain poor. He had always been poor, or at least far from wealthy, and more than one gossip was of the opinion that he had wooed Miss Van Norman not entirely because of disinterested love for her. While Mrs. Markham was busy with these fast-following thoughts, a voice in the doorway made her look up. A quiet, unimportant-looking man stood there, and was respectfully addressing Dr. Hills. "I'm Hunt, sir," he said, "a plainclothesman from headquarters." All three men in the room gave a start of surprise, and each turned an inquiring look at the newcomer. "Who sent you, and what for?" asked Dr. Hills. "I've been here all night, sir. I'm on guard in the present room upstairs." "I engaged him," said Mrs. Markham. "Madeleine's presents are very valuable, and although the jewels are still in the bank, the silver and other things upstairs are worth a large amount, and I thought best to have this man remain here during the night." "A very wise precaution, Mrs. Markham," said Dr. Hills. "And why did you leave your post, my man?" "The butler told me of what had happened, and I wondered if I might be of any service down here. I left the butler in charge of the room while I came down to inquire." "Very thoughtful of you," said Dr. Hills, with a nod of appreciation. "And while I hardly think so, we may have use for you before the night is over. I am expecting Dr. Leonard, the county physician, and until he comes I can do nothing. I am sure the room above is sufficiently guarded for the time being, so suppose you sit down here a few minutes and wait." Mr. Hunt chose to take a seat in the hall, just outside the library door, and thus added one more solemn presence to the quietly waiting group. And now Dr. Hills had occasion to add another puzzling condition to those that had already confronted him. Almost every one in the room was curiously affected by the appearance of this detective, or plainclothesman, as he was called. Schuyler Carleton gave a start, and his pale face became whiter yet. Cicely Dupuy looked at him, and then, turning her glance toward Mr. Hunt, whom she could see through the doorway, she favored the latter with a stare of such venomous hatred that Dr. Hills with difficulty repressed an exclamation. Cicely's big blue eyes roved from Hunt to Carleton and back again, and her little hands clenched as with a firm resolve of some sort in her mind. She seemed to brace herself for action. Her hovering glances annoyed Carleton. He grew nervous, and at last stared straight at her, when her own eyes dropped, and she blushed rosy red. But this side play was observed by no one but Dr. Hills, for the others were evidently absorbed in serious thoughts of their own concerning the advent of Mr. Hunt. Tom Willard stared at him in a sort of perplexity, but Tom's good-natured face had worn that perplexed look ever since he had heard the awful news. He seemed unable to understand, or even to grasp the facts so clearly visible before him. But Miss Morton was more disturbed than anyone else. She looked at Hunt, and an expression of fear came into her eyes. She fidgeted about. She felt in her pocket. She changed her seat twice, and she repeatedly asked Dr. Hills if he thought Dr. Leonard would arrive soon. Dr. Leonard did not live in Mapleton, but motored over from his home in a nearby village. He was a stranger to all those awaiting in the Van Norman house, with the exception of Dr. Hills. Unlike that pleasant-mannered young man, Dr. Leonard was middle-aged, of a crusty disposition and curt speech. When he came, Dr. Hills presented him to the ladies, and before he had time to introduce the two men, Dr. Leonard said crossly, "Put the women out. I cannot conduct this affair with petticoats and hysterics around me." Though not meant to reach the ears of the ladies, the speech was fairly audible, and with a trace of indignation Miss Morton arose and left the room. Mrs. Markham followed her, and Cicely went also. Dr. Leonard closed the library doors, and turning to Dr. Hills, asked for a concise statement of what had happened. In his straightforward manner, Dr. Hills gave a brief outline of the case, including all the necessary details. "And yet," he concluded, "even in the face of that written message, I cannot think it a suicide." "Of course it's a suicide," declared Dr. Leonard in his blustering way. "There is no question whatever. The written confession which you all declare to be in her handwriting is ample proof that the girl killed herself. Of course you had to send for me. The stupid old laws of New Jersey make it imperative that I shall be dragged out many miles away from my home for every death that isn't in conventional deathbed fashion. But there is no suspicion of foul play here. The poor girl chose to kill herself, and she has done so with the means which she found near at hand. I will write the burial certificate and leave it with you. There is no occasion for the coroner." "Thank God for that!" exclaimed Schuyler Carleton in a fervent tone. "Amen," said Tom. "It's dreadful enough to think of poor Maddy as she is, but had it been anyone else who—" Unheeding the ejaculation of these two men, Dr. Hills said earnestly, "But, doctor, if it had not been for the written paper, would you have called it a suicide?" "That has nothing to do with the case," declared Dr. Leonard testily. "The paper is there, and is authentic. No sane man could doubt that it is a suicide after that." "But, Dr. Leonard, it would seem impossible for a woman to stab herself at that angle, and with such an astonishing degree of force. Also to pull the dagger from the wound, cast it on the floor, and then to place her arm in that particular position on the table." "Why do you say in that particular position?" "Because the position of her right arm is as if thrown there carelessly, and not as if flung there in death agony." "You are imaginative, Dr. Hills. The facts may not seem possible, but since they are the facts, you must admit that they are possible." "Very well, Dr. Leonard. I accept your decision, and I relinquish all professional responsibility in the matter." "You may do so. There is no occasion for mystery or question. It is a sad affair, indeed, but no crime is indicated beyond that of self-destruction. The written confession hints at the motive for the deed, but that is outside my jurisdiction. Who is the man in the hall? I fancied him a detective." "He is. That is, he is a man from headquarters who is here to watch over the bridal gifts. He came downstairs thinking we might require his services in another way." "Send him back to his post. There is no work for detectives, just because a young girl chose to end her unhappy life." Dr. Hills opened the library door and directed Hunt to return to his place in the present room. Dr. Leonard, still with his harsh and disagreeable manner, advised Willard and Carleton to go to their homes, saying he and Dr. Hills would remain in charge of the library for the rest of the night. Dr. Hills found the women in the drawing room, awaiting such message as Dr. Leonard might have for them. Dr. Hills told them all that Dr. Leonard had said, and advised them to retire, as the next day would be indeed a difficult and sorrowful one. End of Chapter 4. Chapter 5. A Case for the Coroner. It was characteristic of Miss Morton that she went straight to her own room and shut the door. Mrs. Markham, on the other hand, went to the room occupied by Kitty French. Molly Gardner was there too, and the two girls, robed in kimonos, were sitting white-faced and tearful-eyed, waiting for some further news from the room whence they had been banished. Mrs. Markham told them what Dr. Leonard had said, but Kitty French broke out impetuously, "Madeleine never killed herself, never. I know she always said that about the dagger, but she never really meant it. And anyway, she never would have done it the night before her wedding. I tell you, she didn't do it. It was some horrid burglar who came in to steal her presents, who killed her." "I would almost rather it had been so, Kitty dear," said Mrs. Markham, gently stroking the brow of the excited girl. "But it could not have been, for we have very strong locks and bolts against burglars, and Harris is very careful in his precautions for our safety." "I don't care. Maddy never killed herself. She wouldn't do it. I know her too well. Oh, dear, now there won't be any wedding at all. Isn't it dreadful to think of that decorated room, and the bower we planned for the bride?" At these thoughts Kitty's tears began to flow afresh, and Molly, who was already limp from weeping, joined her. "There, there," said Mrs. Markham, gently patting Molly's shoulder. "Don't cry so, dearie. It can't do any good, and you'll just make yourself ill." "But I don't understand," said Molly, as she mopped her eyes with her wet ball of a handkerchief. "Why did she kill herself?" "I don't know," said Mrs. Markham, but her expression seemed to betoken a sad suspicion. "She didn't kill herself," reiterated Kitty. "I stick to that, but if she did, I know why." This feminine absence of logic was unremarked by her hearers, who both said, "Why?" "Because Schuyler didn't love her enough," said Kitty earnestly. "She just worshipped him, and he used to care more for her, but lately he hasn't." "How do you know?" asked Molly. "Oh, Madeleine didn't tell me," returned Kitty. "I just gathered it. I've been here most a week. You know I came several days before you did, Molly, and I've noticed her a lot. Oh, I don't mean I spied on her, or anything horrid. Only I couldn't help seeing that she wished Mr. Carleton would be more attentive." "Why, I thought he was awfully attentive," said Molly. "Oh, attentive, yes. I don't exactly mean that. But there was something lacking. Don't you think so, Mrs. Markham?" "Yes, Kitty, I do think so. In fact, I know that Mr. Carleton didn't give Madeleine the heart-whole affection that she gave him. But I hoped it would all turn out all right, and I surely never dreamed it was such a serious matter as to bring Madeleine to this. But she was a reserved, proud nature, and if she thought Mr. Carleton had ceased to love her, I know she would far rather die than marry him." "But she could have refused to marry him," cried Molly. "She didn't have to kill herself to get rid of him." "She didn't kill herself," stubbornly repeated Kitty, but Mrs. Markham said, Don't you understand Mattie's nature, Molly? She must have had some sudden and positive proof of Mr. Carleton's lack of true affection for her to drive her to this step. But once convinced that he did not care for her, I know her absolute despair would impel her to the desperate deed." "Why didn't he love her?" said Molly, who could see no reason why any man shouldn't love the magnificent Madeleine. "I think," said Kitty slowly, "there was somebody else." "How did you know that?" exclaimed Mrs. Markham sharply, as if she had detected Kitty in some wrongdoing. "I don't know it, but I can't help thinking so. Madeleine has sometimes asked me if I didn't think most men preferred gentle, timid disposition to a strong, capable nature like her own. Of course, she didn't express it just like that, but she hinted at it so wistfully that I told her no, she was the splendidest, most adorable woman in the whole world. I meant it, too, but at the same time I do think men most always love the soft, tractable kind of girls that are not so imperious and awe-inspiring as Maddy was. Surely Kitty ought to know, for she was the most delicious type of soft, tractable femininity. Her round, dimpled face was positively peachy, and her curling tendrils of goldy hair clustered round a low white brow, above appealing violet eyes. A man might admire the haughty Madeleine, but he would caressingly love bewitching little Kitty, and would involuntarily feel a sense of protection toward her, because of the shy trustfulness in her glance. This was not entirely ingenuous, for a wise little Kitty quite understood her own charm, but it was natural, and in no way forced, and she was quite content that her lines had fallen in her own pleasant places, and she left the magnificent Madeleines of the world to pursue their own rôles. But she had admired and loved Maddy Van Norman, and just because of their differing natures, had understood why Schuyler Carleton's affection was tempered with a certain sense of inferiority. "You know," she went on, as if thinking aloud, "everybody was a little afraid of magnificent Maddy. She was so superb, so regal. You couldn't imagine yourself cuddling her." "I should say not!" exclaimed Molly. "I could only imagine salaaming to her, or deferentially kissing her hand." "Yes, that's what I mean. Well, Mr. Carleton got tired of that stilted kind of an attitude, or at least she thought he did. I don't know, I'm sure, but she was possessed with a notion that he cared for some other girl, someone of the clinging rosebud sort." "Do you know this?" asked Mrs. Markham. "I mean, do you know that Maddy thought this?" "Yes, I know it," asserted Kitty, with a wag of her wise little head. "I tried to persuade her that no clinging rosebud could rival a tall, proud lily, but she thoroughly believed there was someone else." "But Mr. Carleton was to marry her," said Mrs. Markham. "I can't believe he would do that if he loved another." "That's what bothered Maddy," said Kitty. "She knew how honorable Mr. Carleton had always been, and she said that as he was engaged to her, he would think it his duty to marry her, even though his heart belonged to someone else." "Oh, pshaw!" said Molly. "If he was going to marry her, and didn't love her, it was because of her fortune. Probably his rosebud girl hasn't a cent." "Don't talk like that," said Kitty, shuddering. "Somehow it seems disloyal to both of them." "But it is all true," said Mrs. Markham sadly. "Madeleine has never been of a confidential nature, but I know that she had the idea Kitty tells of, and I fear it was true. And I may be disloyal, or even unjust, but I can't help thinking Schuyler was attracted to Mattie's money. He is proud and ambitious, and he would be quite in his element as the head of a fine establishment, with plenty of money to spend on it." "Well, he'll never have it now," said Molly, and as this brought back the realization of the awful event that had happened, both girls burst into crying again. Mrs. Markham, herself with overwrought nerves, found she could do nothing to comfort the girls, so left them and went to commune with her grief in her own room. Meantime, the two doctors alone in the library were still in discussion. "Well, what do you want?" inquired Dr. Leonard angrily. "Do you want to imply, and with no evidence whatever, that the girl died by some hand other than her own? Do you want to involve the family in the expense and unpleasant publicity of a coroner's inquest, when there is not only no reason for such a proceeding, but there is every reason against it?" "I want nothing but to get at the truth," rejoined Dr. Hills, a little ruffled himself. "I hold that a young woman, unless endowed with unusual strength, or possibly under stress of intense passion, could not inflict upon herself a blow strong enough to drive that dagger to the hilt in her own breast, pull it forth again, and cast it on the floor, and after that place her arm in the position it now occupies." Dr. Leonard looked thoughtful. "I agree with you," he said slowly. "That is, I agree that it does not seem as if a woman could do that. But, my dear Dr. Hills, Miss Van Norman did do that. We know she did, from her own written confession, and also by the theory of elimination. What else could have happened? Have you any suggestions to advance?" Dr. Hills was somewhat taken aback at Dr. Leonard's suddenness. Up to this moment the county physician had stoutly maintained that the case was a suicide beyond any question, and then, turning, he had put the question to the younger doctor in such a way that Dr. Hills was not quite ready with an answer. "No," he said hesitatingly, "I have no theory to advance, and, moreover, I do not consider this an occasion for theories. But we must ascertain the facts. I state it as a fact that a woman could not stab herself as Miss Van Norman is stabbed, withdraw the dagger, and then place her right arm on the table in the position you see it." "And I assert that you are stating what is not a fact, but merely your own opinion." Dr. Hills looked disconcerted at this. His companion was an older and far more experienced man than himself, and not only did Dr. Hills have no desire to antagonize him, but he wished to show him the deference that was justly his due. "You are right," he said frankly. "It is merely my own opinion. But now will you give me yours, based not on the written paper, but in the position and general effect of the body of Miss Van Norman?" Put thus in his mettle, Dr. Leonard looked carefully at the dead girl, whose pose was so natural and graceful that she might have been merely sitting there, resting. He gazed long and intently, and then said slowly, "I see your point, Dr. Hills. It was a vigorous blow, suddenly and forcefully given. It could scarcely have been done had the subject been a frail, slight woman. But Miss Van Norman was of a strong, even athletic build, and her whole physical make-up indicates strength and force of muscle. Your observation as to her apparent natural position is all right so far as it goes, but I have observed more carefully still, and I notice her evident physical strength, which was doubtless greatly aided by her stress of mental passion, and I aver that a woman of her physique could have driven the blow, removed the weapon, and perhaps even then unconscious, have thrown her arm on the table as we now see it." "I thank you, Doctor Leonard," said young Hills, "for your patience with me. You are doubtless right, and I frankly admit you have made out a clear case. Miss Van Norman was indeed a strong woman. I have been the family physician for several years, and I know her robust constitution. Knowing this, and appreciating your superior judgment as to the possibility of the deed, I am forced to admit your opinion is the true one. And yet—" "Besides, Doctor Hills," went on Doctor Leonard, as the younger man hesitated, "we we must not, ignore the written paper. Why should we do so? Those who know tell us Miss Van Norman wrote it. It is, therefore, her dying statement. Dare we disregard her last message, written in explanation of her otherwise inexplicable act? We may wonder at this suicide, we may shudder at it, but we may not doubt that it is a suicide. That paper is not merely evidence, it is testimony, it is incontrovertible proof." Doctor Leonard ceased speaking, and sat silent because he had nothing more to say. Dr. Hills also sat silent, because, try as he might, he could not feel convinced that the older physician was right. It was absurd, he well knew, but every time he glanced at the relaxed pose of that white right arm on the table, he felt more than ever sure that it had lain there just so when the dagger entered the girl's breast. As the two men sat there, almost as motionless as the other still figure, both saw the knob of the door turn. They had closed the double doors leading to the hall on the arrival of Doctor Leonard, and now the knob of one of them was slowly and noiselessly turning round. A glance of recognition passed between them, but neither spoke or moved. A moment later, the knob having turned completely round, the door began to open very slowly. Owing to the position of the two men, it was necessary for the door to be opened far enough to admit the intruder's head before they could be seen, and the doctors waited breathlessly to see who it might be who desired to come stealthily to the library that night. Dr. Hills, whose thoughts worked quickly, had already assumed it was Mrs. Markham, coming to gaze once more on her beloved mistress. But Dr. Leonard formulated no supposition, and merely wanted to see. At the edge of the door appeared first a yellow pompadour, followed by the wide-open blue eyes of Cicely Dupuy. Seeing the two men, she came no further into the room, but gave a sort of gasp, and pulled the door quickly shut again. In the still house, the two listeners could hear her footsteps crossing the hall and ascending the stairs. "Curious, that," murmured Dr. Hills. "If she wanted to look once more on Miss Van Norman's face, why so stealthy about it? And if she didn't want that, what did she want?" "I don't know," rejoined Doctor Leonard, "but I see nothing suspicious about it. Doubtless she did come for a last glance alone at Miss Van Norman, but seeing us here, didn't care to enter." "But she gave a strange little shuddering gasp, as if frightened." "Natural excitement at the strange and awful conditions now present." "Yes, no doubt." Dr. Hills spoke a bit impatiently. The phlegmatic attitude of his colleague jarred on his own overwrought nerves, and he rose and walked about the room, now and then stopping to scrutinize anew the victim of the cruel dagger. At last he stood still, across the table from her, but looking at Doctor Leonard. "I have no suggestion to make," he said slowly. "I have no theory to offer. But I am firmly convinced that Madeleine Van Norman did not strike the blow that took away her life. Perhaps this is more a feeling or an intuition than a logical conviction, but—" He hesitated and looked intently at the dead girl, as if trying to force the secret from her. With a sudden start he took a step forward, and as he spoke his voice rang with excitement. "Doctor Leonard," he said, in a quick, concise voice, "will you look carefully at that dagger?" "Yes," said the older man, impressed by the other's sudden intensity, and, stepping forward, he scrutinized the dagger as it lay on the table, without, however, touching it. "There is blood on the handle," went on Doctor Hills. "Yes, several stains, now dried." "And do you see any blood on the right hand of Miss Van Norman?" Startled at the implication, Doctor Leonard bent to examine the cold white hand. Not a trace of blood was on it. Instinctively he looked at the girl's left hand, only to find that also immaculately white. Doctor Leonard stood upright and pulled himself together. "I was wrong, Doctor Hills," he said, with a nod which in him betokened an unspoken apology. "It is a case for the coroner." Chapter 6. Fessenden Comes. It was about 9 o'clock the next morning when Rob Fessenden rang the bell of the Van Norman house. Having heard nothing of the events of the night, he had called to offer any assistance he might give before the ceremony. The trailing garland of white flowers with fluttering streamers of white ribbon that hung beside the portal struck a chill to his heart. "What can have happened?" he thought blankly, and confused ideas of motor accidents were thronging his mind as the door was opened for him. The demeanor of the footman at once told him that he was in a house of mourning. Shown into the drawing-room, he was met by Cicely Dupuy. "Mr. Fessenden!" she exclaimed as she greeted him. "Then you have not heard?" "I've heard nothing. What is it?" Poor Miss Dupuy had bravely taken up the burden of telling the sad story to callers who did not know of it, and this was not the first time that morning she had enlightened inquiring friends. In a few words she told Mr. Fessenden of the events of the night before. He was shocked and sincerely grieved. Although his acquaintance with Miss Van Norman was slight, he was Schuyler Carleton's oldest and best friend, and so he had come from New York the day before in order to take his part at the wedding. While they were talking, Kitty French came in. As Mr. Fessenden began to converse with her, Cicely excused herself and left the room. "Isn't it awful?" began Kitty, and her tear-filled eyes supplemented the trite sentence. "It is indeed," said Rob Fessenden, taking her hand in spontaneous sympathy. "Why should she do it?" "She didn't do it," declared Kitty earnestly. "Mr. Fessenden, they all say she killed herself, but I know she didn't. Won't you help me to prove that, and to find out who did kill her?" "What do you mean, Miss French? Miss Dupuy just told me it was a suicide." "They all say so, but I know better. Oh, I wish somebody would help me. Molly doesn't think as I do, and I can't do anything all alone." Miss French's face was small and flower-like, and when she clasped her little hands and bewailed her inability to prove her belief, young Fessenden thought he had never seen such a perfect picture of beautiful helplessness. Without reserve, he instantly resolved to aid and advise her to the best of his own ability. "And Mrs. Markham doesn't think as I do either," went on Kitty. "Nobody thinks as I do." "I will think as you do," declared Fessenden, and so potent was the charm of the tearful violet eyes that he was quite ready to think whatever she dictated. "Only tell me what to think, and what to do about it." "Why, I think Madeleine didn't kill herself at all. I think somebody else killed her." "But who would do such a thing? You see, Miss French, I know nothing of the particulars. I saw Miss Van Norman for the first time yesterday." "Had you never met her before?" "Oh, yes, a few years ago. But I mean I came to Mapleton only yesterday, and saw her in the afternoon. I was to be Schuyler's best man, you know, and as he didn't come here to dinner last night, I thought I'd better not come either, though I had been asked. He was a little miffed with Miss Van Norman, you know." "Yes, I know. Maddy did flirt with Tom, and it always annoyed Mr. Carleton. Did you dine with him?" "Yes, at his home. I am staying there. By the way, I met Miss Burt there. Do you know her?" "No, not at all. Who is she?" "She's a companion to Mrs. Carleton, Schuyler's mother. I never saw her until last night at dinner." "No, I don't know her," repeated Kitty. "I don't believe she was invited to the wedding, for I looked over the list of invitations. Still, her name may have been there. The list was so very long." "And now there'll be no wedding and no guests." "No," said Kitty, "only guests at a far different ceremony." Again the deep violet eyes filled with tears, and Fessenden was conscious of a longing to comfort and help the poor little girl thrown thus suddenly into the first tragedy of her life. "It would be dreadful enough if she had died from an illness," he said, "but this added awfulness—" "Yes," interrupted Kitty, "but to me the worst part is for them to say she killed herself, and I know she didn't. Why, Maddy was too fine and big-natured to do such a cowardly thing." "She seems so to me, too, though of course I didn't know her so well as you did." "No, I'm one of her nearest friends, though Madeleine was never one to have really intimate friends. But as her friend, I want to try to do what I can to put her right in the face of the world. And you said you'd help me." She looked at Fessenden with such hopefully appealing eyes that he would willingly have helped her in any way he could, but he also realized that it was a very serious proposition this young girl was making. "I will help you, Miss French," he said gravely. "I know little of the details of the case, but if there is the slightest chance that you might be right, rest assured that you shall be given every chance to prove it." Kitty French gave a sigh of relief. "Oh, thank you," she said earnestly. "But I'm afraid we cannot do much, however well we intend. Of course, I'm merely a guest here, and I have no authority of any sort. And, too, to prove that Maddy did not kill herself would mean having a detective and everything like that." "I may not be everything like that," said Fessenden, with a faint smile, "but I am a sort of detective in an amateur way. I've had quite a good deal of experience, and though I wouldn't take a case officially, I'm sure I could at least discover if your suspicions have any grounds." "But I haven't any suspicions," said Kitty, agitatedly clasping her little hands against her breast. "I've only a feeling, a deep, positive conviction that Madeleine did not kill herself. and I'm sure I don't know who did kill her." Fessenden gave that grave smile of his, and only said, "That doesn't sound like much to work upon, and yet I would often trust a woman's intuitive knowledge against the most conspicuous clues or evidences." Kitty thanked him with a smile, but before she could speak, Miss Morton came into the room. "It's perfectly dreadful," that lady began, in her impetuous way. "They're going to have the coroner after all. Dr. Leonard has sent for him, and he may arrive at any minute. Isn't it awful? There'll be an inquest, and the house will be thronged with all sorts of people." "Why are they going to have an inquest?" demanded Kitty, whirling around and grasping Miss Morton by her elbows. "Because," she said, quite as excited as Kitty herself, "because the doctors think that perhaps Madeleine didn't kill herself, that she was "Murdered!" exclaimed Kitty. "I knew it! I knew she was! Who killed her?" "Mercy, I don't know!" exclaimed Miss Morton, frightened at Kitty's vehemence. "That's what the coroner is coming to find out." "But who do you think did it? You must have some idea." "I haven't. Don't look at me like that. What do you mean?" "It must have been a burglar," went on Kitty, "because it couldn't have been anyone else. But why didn't he steal things? Perhaps he did. We never thought to look." "How you do run on! Nobody could steal the presents, because there was a policeman in the house all the time." "Then why didn't he catch the burglar?" demanded Kitty, grasping Miss Morton's arm, as if that lady had information that must be dragged from her by force. Feeling interested in getting at the facts in the case, and thinking that he could learn little from these two excited women, Rob Fessenden turned into the hall just in time to meet Dr. Hills, who was coming from the library. "May I introduce myself?" he said. "I'm Robert Fessenden, of New York, a lawyer, and I was to have been best man at the wedding. You, I know, are Dr. Hills, and I want to say to you that if the earnest endeavor of an amateur detective would be of any use to you in this matter, it is at your disposal. Mr. Carleton is my old and dear friend, and I need not tell you how he now calls forth my sympathy." Instinctively, Dr. Hills liked this young man. His frank manner and pleasant, straightforward ways impressed the doctor favorably, and he shook hands warmly as he said, "This is most kind of you, Mr. Fessenden, and you may prove the very man we need. At first we were all convinced that Miss Van Norman's death was a suicide, and though the evidence still strongly points to that, I am sure that there is a possibility, at least, that it is not true. May I learn the details of the case? May I go into the library?" said Fessenden, hesitating to approach the closed door until invited. "Yes, indeed. I'll take you in at once. Dr. Leonard, who is in there, is the county physician, and though a bit brusque in his manner, he is an honest old soul, and does unflinchingly what he judges to be his duty. Neither then nor at any time, neither to Dr. Leonard himself nor to anyone else, did Dr. Hills ever mention the difference of opinion which the two men had held for so long the night before, nor did he tell how he had proved his own theory so positively that Dr. Leonard had been obliged to confess himself wrong. It was not in Dr. Hill's nature to say, "I told you so," and fully appreciating this, Dr. Leonard said nothing either, but threw himself into the case heart and soul in his endeavors to seek truth and justice. Fessenden and Dr. Hills entered the library, where everything was much as it had been the night before. At one time the doctors had been about to move the body to a couch and to remove the disfigured gown. But after Dr. Leonard had been persuaded to agree with Dr. Hill's view of the case, they had left everything untouched until the coroner should come. The discovery of this was a satisfaction to Robert Fessenden. His detective instinct had begun to assert itself, and he was glad of an opportunity to examine the room before the arrival of the coroner. Though not seeming unduly curious, his eyes darted about in an eager search for possible clues of any sort. Without touching them, he examined the dagger, the written paper, the appointments of the library table, and the body itself, with its sweet, sad face, its drooping posture, and its tragically stained raiment. In true detective fashion, he scrutinized the carpet, glanced at the window fastenings, and noted the appointments of the library table. The only thing Fessenden touched, however, was a lead pencil which lay on the pen rack. It was an ordinary pencil, but he gazed intently at the gilt lettering stamped upon it, and then returned it to its place. Again he glanced quickly but carefully at every article on the table, and then, taking a chair, sat quietly in a corner, unobtrusive but alert. With something of a bustling air, the coroner came in. Coroner Benson was a fussy sort of man, with a somewhat exaggerated sense of his own importance. He paused with what he probably considered a dramatic start when he saw the dead body of Miss Van Norman, and, shaking his head, said, "Alas, alas!" in tragic tones. Miss Morton and Kitty French had followed him in, and stood arm in arm, a little bewildered, but determined to know whatever might transpire. Cicely Dupuy and Miss Markham had also come in. But after a glance round and a preliminary clearing of his throat, he at once requested that everybody except the two doctors should leave the room. Fessenden and Kitty French were greatly disappointed at this, but the others went out with a feeling of relief, for the strain was beginning to tell upon the nerves of all concerned. As usual, Miss Morton tried to exercise her powers of generalship, and directed that they should all assemble in the drawing-room until recalled to learn the coroner's opinion. Mrs. Markham, unheeding Miss Morton's dictum, went away to attend to her household duties, and Cicely went to her own room, but the others waited in the drawing-room. They were joined shortly by Tom Willard and Schuyler Carleton, who arrived at about the same time. Mr. Carleton, never a robust man, looked like a wreck of his former self. Years had been added to his apparent age. His impassive face wore a look of stony grief, and his dark eyes seemed filled with an unutterable horror. Tom Willard, on the contrary, being of stout build and rubicund countenance, seemed an ill-fitting figure in the sad and tearful group. But as Kitty French remarked to Fessenden in a whisper, "Poor Tom probably feels the worst of any of us, and it isn't his fault that he can't make that fat, jolly face of his look more funereal." "And he's said to be the heir to the estate, too," Fessenden whispered back. "Now, that's mean of you," declared Kitty. "Tom hasn't a greedy hair in his head, and I don't believe he has even thought of his fortune. And besides, he was desperately in love with Madeleine. A whole heap more in love than Mr. Carleton was." Fessenden stared at her. "Then why was Carleton marrying her?" "For her money," said Kitty with a disdainful air. "I didn't know that. went on Fessenden quite seriously. "I thought Carleton was hard hit. She was a magnificent woman." "Oh, she was indeed," agreed Kitty enthusiastically. "Mr. Carleton didn't half appreciate her, and Tom did. But then she was always very different with Tom. Somehow she always seemed constrained when with Mr. Carleton." "Then why was she marrying him?" "She was terribly in love with him. She liked Tom only in a cousinly way, but she adored Mr. Carleton. I know it." "Well, it seems you were right about her not killing herself, so you're probably right about this matter, too." "Now that shows a nice spirit," said Kitty, smiling, even in the midst of her sorrow. "But truly, I'm most always right. Aren't you?" "I shall be after this, for I'm always going to agree with you." "That's a pretty large order, for I'm sometimes awfully disagreeable." "I shouldn't believe that, but I've practically promised to believe everything you tell me, so I suppose I shall have to." "Oh, now I have defeated my own ends. Well, never mind. Abide by your first impression, that I'm always right, and then go ahead." "Go ahead it is," declared Fessenden, and then Molly Gardner joined them. Molly was more overcome by the tragic turn affairs had taken than Kitty, and had only just made her appearance downstairs that day. "You dear child," cried Kitty, noting her pale cheeks and sad eyes. "Sit right down here by us, and let Mr. Fessenden talk to you. He's the nicest man in the world to cheer anyone up." "And you look as if you need some cheering, Miss Gardner," said Fessenden, arranging some pillows at her back, as she languidly dropped down on the sofa. "I can't realize it at all," said poor Molly. "I don't want to be silly and keep fainting all over the place, but every time I remember how Maddy looked last night—" She glanced toward the closed library doors with a shudder. "Don't think about it," said Rob Fessenden gently. "What you need most, Miss Gardner, is a bit of fresh air. Come with me for a little walk in the grounds." This was self-sacrifice on the part of the young man, for he greatly desired to be present when the coroner should open the closed doors to them again. But he really thought Miss Gardner would be better for a short brisk walk, and getting her some wraps, they went out at the front door. Chapter 7. Mr. Benson's Questions. It was some time after Fessenden and Molly had returned from their walk that the library doors were thrown open and Coroner Benson invited them all to come in. They filed in slowly, each heart heavy with an impending sense of dread. Dr. Hills ushered them to seats which had been arranged in rows, and which gave an unpleasantly formal air to the cozy library. The body of Madeleine Van Norman had been taken upstairs to her own room, and at the library table, where she had last sat, stood Coroner Benson. The women were seated in front. Mrs. Markham seemed to have settled into a sort of sad apathy, but Miss Morton was briskly alert, and though evidently nervous, seemed eager to hear what the coroner had to tell. Kitty French, too, was full of anxious interest, and taking the seat assigned to her, clasped her hands in breathless suspense, while a high color rose to her lovely cheeks. Molly Gardner was pale and wan-looking. She dreaded the whole scene, and had but one desire, to get away from Mapleton. She could have gone to her room, had she chosen, but the idea of being all alone was even worse than the present conditions. So she sat, with overwrought nerves, now and then clutching at Kitty's sleeve. Cicely Dupuy was very calm, so calm indeed that one might guess it was the composure of an all-compelling determination, and by no means the quiet of indifference. Marie was there, and showed the impassive face of the well-trained servant, though her volatile French nature was discernible in her quick darting glances and quivering sensitive lips. The two doctors, Mr. Carleton, Tom Willard, and young Fessenden occupied the next row of seats, and behind them were the house servants. Unlike the women, the men showed little or no emotion on their faces. All were grave and composed, and even Dr. Leonard seemed to have laid aside his brusque and aggressive ways. As he stood facing this group, Coroner Benson was fully alive to the importance of his own position, and he quite consciously determined to conduct the proceedings in a way to throw great credit upon himself in his official capacity. After an impressive pause, which he seemed to deem necessary to gain the attention of an already breathlessly listening audience, he began, "While there is much evidence that seems to prove that Miss Van Norman took her own life, there is very grave reason to doubt this. Both of the eminent physicians here present are inclined to believe that the dagger thrust which killed Miss Van Norman was not inflicted by her own hand, though it may have been so. This conclusion they arrive at from their scientific knowledge of the nature and direction of dagger strokes, which, as may not be generally known, is a science in itself. Indeed, were it not for the conclusive evidence of the written paper, these gentlemen would believe that the stroke was impossible of self-infliction. But, aside from this point, we are confronted by this startling fact. Although the dagger, which you may see still lying on the table, has several blood stains on its handle, there is absolutely no trace of blood on the right hand of the body of Miss Van Norman. It is inconceivable that she could have removed such a trace, had there been any, and it is highly improbable, if not indeed impossible, that she could have handled the dagger and left it in its present condition, without showing a corresponding stain on her hand." The speech of Coroner Benson's produced a decided sensation on all his hearers, but it was manifested in various ways. Kitty French exchanged with Fessenden a satisfied nod, for this seemed in line with her own theory. Fessenden returned the nod, and even gave Kitty a faint smile, for who could look at that lovely face without a pleasant recognition of some sort? And then he folded his arms and began to think hard. Yet there was little food for coherent thought. Granting the logical deduction from the absence of any stain on Miss Van Norman's hands, there was, as yet, not the slightest indication of any direction in which to look for the dastard who had done the deed. Schuyler Carleton showed no emotion, but his white face seemed to take on one more degree of horror and misery. Tom Willard looked blankly amazed, and Mrs. Markham began on a new one of her successive crying spells. Miss Morton sat bolt upright, and placidly smoothed the gray silk folds of her gown, while her face wore a decided "I told you so" expression, though she hadn't told them anything of the sort. But as Fessenden watched her, the rows of seats were slightly horseshoed, and he could see her side face well, he noticed that she was really trembling all over, and that her placidity of face was without doubt assumed for effect. He could not see her eyes, but he was positive that only a strong fear or terror of something could explain her admirably suppressed agitation. The behavior of Cicely Dupuy was perhaps the most extraordinary. She flew into a fit of violent hysterics, and had to be taken from the room. Marie followed her, as it had always been part of the French maid's duty to attend Miss Dupuy upon occasion as well as Miss Van Norman. "In view of this state of affairs," went on the coroner, when quiet had been restored after Cicely's departure, "it becomes necessary to make an investigation of the case. We have absolutely no evidence, and no real reason to suspect foul play. Yet, since there is the merest possibility that the death was not a suicide, it becomes my duty to look further into the matter. I have been told that Miss Van Norman had expressed a sort of general fear that she might some day be impelled to turn this dagger upon herself. But that is a peculiar mental obsession that affects many people at sight of a sharp-pointed or cutting instrument, and is by no means a proof that she did do this thing. But, quite aside from the temptation of the glittering steel, we have Miss Van Norman's written confession that she at least contemplated taking her own life, and ascribing a reason therefor. In further consideration, then, of this written paper, of which you all know the contents, can any of you tell me of any fact or quote any words spoken by Miss Van Norman that would corroborate or amplify the statement of this despairing message?" As Mr. Benson spoke, he held in his hand the written paper that had been found on the library table. It was indeed unnecessary to read it aloud, for everyone present knew its contents by heart. But nobody responded to the coroner's question. Mr. Carleton looked mutely helpless. Tom Willard looked honestly perplexed, and yet many of those present believed that both these men knew the sad secret of Madeleine's life, and understood definitely the written message. Again Mr. Benson earnestly requested that any one knowing the least fact, however trivial, regarding the matter would mention it. Then Mrs. Markham spoke. "I can tell you nothing but my own surmise," she said. "I know nothing for certain, but I have reason to believe that Madeleine Van Norman had a deep sorrow, such a one as would impel her to write that statement, and to act in accordance with it." "That is what I wish to know," said Coroner Benson. "It is not necessary for you to detail the nature of her sorrow, or even to hint at it further, but the assurance that the message is in accordance with Miss Van Norman's mental attitude goes far toward convincing me that her death is the outcome of that written declaration." "I know, too," volunteered Kitty French, "that Madeleine meant every word she wrote there. She was miserable, and for the very reason that she herself stated." Mr. Benson pinched his glasses more firmly on his nose, and turned his gaze slowly toward Miss French. Kitty had spoken impulsively, and perhaps too directly, but, though embarrassed at the sensation she had caused, she showed no desire to retract her statements. "I am told," said the coroner, his voice ringing out clearly in the strange silence that had fallen on the room, "that the initial on this paper designates Mr. Schuyler Carleton. I must therefore ask Mr. Carleton if he can explain the reference to himself." "I cannot," said Schuyler Carleton, and only the intense silence allowed his low whisper to be heard. "Miss Van Norman was my affianced wife. We were to have been married to-day. Those two facts, I think, prove the existence of our mutual love. The paper is to me inexplicable." Tom Willard looked at the speaker with an expression of frank unbelief, and indeed most of the auditors' faces betrayed incredulity. Even with no previous reason to imagine that Carleton did not love Madeleine, the tragic message proved it beyond all possible doubt. And yet it was but natural for the man to deny it. Doctor Hills spoke next. "I think, Coroner Benson," he said, as he rose to his feet, "we are missing the point. If Miss Van Norman took her life in fulfillment of her own decision, the reasons that brought about that decision are not a matter for our consideration. It is for us to decide whether she did or did not bring about her own death. And as a mode of procedure, may I suggest this? Dr. Leonard and myself hold that in view of the absence of any stain on Miss Van Norman's hands, she could not have handled the stained dagger that killed her. A refutation of this opinion would be to explain how she could have done the deed and left no trace on her fingers. Unless this can be shown, I think we can not call it a suicide." Although nothing would have induced him to admit it, Coroner Benson was greatly accommodated by this suggestion, and, immediately adopting it as his own promulgation, he repeated it almost exactly word for word as his official dictum. "And so," he concluded, "as I have now explained, unless a theory can be offered on this point, we must agree that Miss Van Norman's unfortunate death was not by her own hand." Robert Fessenden arose. "I have no theory," he said. "I have no argument to offer. But I am sure we all wish to discover the truth by means of any light that any of us may throw on the mystery. And I want to say that in my opinion the absence of blood on the hands, though it indicates, does not positively prove that the weapon was held by another than the victim. Might it not be that, taking the dagger from the table, clean as of course it was, Miss Van Norman turned it upon herself, and then, withdrawing it, let it drop to the floor, where it subsequently became blood-stained, as did the rug and her own gown?" The two doctors listened intently. It was characteristic of both that though Dr. Hills had shown no elation when he had convinced Dr. Leonard of his mistake the night before, yet now Dr. Leonard could not repress a gleam of triumph in his eyes as he turned to Dr. Hills. "It is possible," said Mr. Benson, with a cautiously dubious air, though really the theory struck him as extremely probable, and he wished he had advanced it himself. Dr. Hills looked thoughtful, and then, as nobody else spoke, he observed, "Mr. Carleton might perhaps judge of that point. As he first discovered the dagger and picked it up from the floor, he can perhaps say if it lay in or near the stains on the carpet." Everybody looked at Schuyler Carleton, but the man had reached the limit of his endurance. "I don't know," he exclaimed, covering his white face with his hands, as if to shut out the awful memory. "Do you suppose I noticed such details?" he cried, looking up again. "I picked up the dagger, scarce knowing that I did it. It was almost an unconscious act. I was stunned, dazed, at what I saw before me, and I know nothing of the dagger or its blood-stains." Truly, the man was almost frenzied, and out of consideration for his perturbed state, the coroner asked him no more questions just then. "It seems to me," observed Rob Fessenden, "that the nature or shape of the stains on the dagger handle might determine this point. If they appear to be finger marks, the weapon must have been held by some other hand. If merely stains, as from the floor, they might be considered to strengthen Dr. Hill's theory." The Venetian paper cutter was produced and passed around. None of the women would touch it or even look at it, except Kitty French. She examined it carefully, but had no opinion to offer, and Mr. Benson waited impatiently for her to finish her scrutiny. He had no wish to hear her remarks on the subject, for he deemed her a mere frivolous girl, who had no business to take any part in the serious inquiry. All were requested not to touch the weapon, which was passed round on a brass tray, taken from the library table. Schuyler Carleton covered his eyes and refused to glance at it. Tom Willard and Robert Fessenden looked at it at the same time, holding the tray between them. "I make out no fingerprints," said Tom, at last. "Do you?" "No," said Fessenden. "That is, not surely. These may be marks of fingers, but they are far too indistinct to say so positively. What do you think, Doctor Leonard?" The gruesome property was passed on to the two doctors, who examined it with the greatest care. Going to the window, they looked at it with magnifying glasses, and finally reported that the slight marks might be finger marks, or might be the abrasion of the nap of the rug on which the dagger had fallen. "Then," said Coroner Benson, "we have so far no evidence which refutes the theory that Miss Van Norman's written message was the expression of her deliberate intent, and that that intention was fulfilled by her." Once more Mr. Benson scanned intently the faces of his audience. "Can no one, then," he said again, "assert or suggest anything that may have any bearing on this written message?" "I can," said Robert Fessenden. Chapter 8. A Soft Lead Pencil. Coroner Benson looked at the young man curiously. Knowing him to be a stranger in the household, he had not expected information from him. "Your name?" he said quietly. "I am Robert Fessenden, of New York City. I am a lawyer by profession, and I came to Mapleton yesterday for the purpose of acting as best man at Mr. Carleton's wedding. I came here this morning, not knowing of what had occurred in the night, and after conversation with some members of the household, I felt impelled to investigate some points which seemed to me mysterious. I trust I have shown no intrusive curiosity, but I confess to a natural detective instinct, and I noticed some peculiarities about that paper you hold in your hand, to which I should like to call your attention." Fessenden's words caused a decided stir among his hearers, including the coroner and the two doctors. Mr. Benson was truly anxious to learn what the young man had to say, but at the same time his professional jealousy was aroused by the implication that there was anything to be learned from the paper itself, outside of his own information concerning it. "I was told," he said quickly, "that this paper is positively written in Miss Van Norman's own hand." Robert Fessenden, while not exactly a handsome man, was of a type that impressed everyone pleasantly. He was large and blond, and had an air that was unmistakably cultured and exceedingly well bred. Conventionality sat well upon him, and his courteous self-assurance had in it no trace of egotism or self-importance. In a word, he was what the plain-spoken people of Mapleton called citified, and though they sometimes resented this combination of personal traits, in their hearts they admired and envied it. This was why Coroner Benson felt a slight irritation at the young man's savoir-faire, and at the same time a sense of satisfaction that there was promise of some worth-while help. "I was told so, too," said Fessenden in response to the coroner's remark, "and as I have never seen any of Miss Van Norman's writing, I have, of course, no reason to doubt this. But this is the point I want to inquire about. Is it assumed that Miss Van Norman wrote the words on this paper while sitting here at the table last evening, immediately or shortly before her death?" Mr. Benson thought a moment. Then he said, Without any evidence to the contrary, and indeed without having given this question any previous thought, I think I may say that it has been tacitly assumed that this is a dying confession of Miss Van Norman's." He looked inquiringly at his audience, and Doctor Hills responded. "Yes," he said, "we have taken for granted that Miss Van Norman wrote the message while sitting here last evening, after the rest of the household had retired. This we infer from the fact of Mr. Carleton's finding the paper on the table when he discovered the tragedy." "You thought the same, Mr. Carleton?" "Of course. I could not do otherwise than to believe Miss Van Norman had written the message and had then carried out her resolve." "I think, Mr. Fessenden," resumed the coroner, "we may assume this to be the case." "Then," said Fessenden, "I will undertake to show that it is improbable that this paper was written as has been supposed. The message is, as you see, written in pencil. The pencil here on the table, and which is part of a set of desk fittings, is a very hard pencil, labeled H. A few marks made by it upon a bit of paper will convince you at once that it is not the pencil which was used to write that message. The letters, as you see, are formed of heavy black marks, which were made with a very soft pencil, such as is designated by 2B or BB. If you please, I will pause for a moment while you satisfy yourself upon this point." Greatly interested, Mr. Benson took the pencil from the pen rack and wrote some words upon a pad of paper. Dr. Leonard and Dr. Hills leaned over the table to note results, but no one else stirred. "You are quite right," said Mr. Benson. "This message was not written with this pencil. But what does that prove?" "It proves nothing," said Fessenden calmly. "But it is pretty strong evidence that the message was not written at this table last night. For had there been any other pencil on the table, it would doubtless have remained. Assuming, then, that Miss Van Norman wrote this message elsewhere, and with another pencil, it loses the special importance commonly attributed to the words of one about to die." "It does," said Mr. Benson, impressed by the fact, but at a loss to know whither the argument was leading. "Believing, then," went on the lawyer, "that this paper had not been written in this room last evening, I began to conjecture where it had been written, for one would scarcely expect a message of that nature to be written in one place and carried to another. I was so firmly convinced that something could be learned on this point that just before we were summoned to this room I asked permission of Mrs. Markham to examine the appointments of Miss Van Norman's writing desk in her own room, and I found in her desk no soft pencils whatever. There were several pencils, of gold and of silver and of ordinary wood, but the lead in each was as hard as this one on the library table. Urged on by what seemed to me important developments, I persuaded Mrs. Markham to let me examine all of the writing desks in the house. I found but one soft pencil, and that was in the desk of Miss Dupuy, Miss Van Norman's secretary. It is quite conceivable that Miss Van Norman should write at her secretary's desk, but I found myself suddenly confronted by another disclosure, and that is that the handwritings of Miss Van Norman and Miss Dupuy are so similar as to be almost identical. In view of the importance of this written message, should it not be more carefully proved that this writing is really Miss Van Norman's own?" "It should indeed," declared Coroner Benson, who was by this time quite ready to agree to any suggestion Mr. Fessenden might make. "Will somebody please ask Miss Dupuy to come here?" "I will," said Miss Morton, and rising, she quickly rustled from the room. Of course every one present immediately remembered that Miss Dupuy had left the room in a fit of hysterical emotion, and wondered in what frame of mind she would return. Nearly every one, too, resented Miss Morton's officiousness. Whatever errand was to be done, she volunteered to do it, quite as if she were a prominent member of the household, instead of a lately arrived guest. "This similarity of penmanship is a very important point," observed Mr. Benson. "A very important point indeed. I am surprised that it has not been remarked sooner." "I've often noticed that they wrote alike," said Kitty French impulsively, "but I never thought about it before in this matter. You see," she involuntarily addressed herself to the coroner, who listened with interest, "you see, Madeleine instructed Cicely to write as nearly as possible like she did, because Cicely was her social secretary and answered all her notes, and wrote letters for her, and sometimes Cicely signed Madeleine's name to the notes, and the people who received them thought Maddy wrote them herself. She didn't mean to deceive, only sometimes people don't like to have their notes answered by a secretary, and so it saved a lot of trouble. I confess," Kitty concluded, "that I can't always tell the difference in their writing myself, though I usually can." Miss Morton returned, bringing Cicely with her. Still officious of manner, Miss Morton rearranged some chairs, and then seated herself in the front row with Cicely beside her. She showed what seemed almost an air of proprietorship in the girl, patting her shoulder and whispering to her, as if by way of encouragement. But Miss Dupuy's demeanor had greatly changed. No longer weeping, she had assumed an almost defiant attitude, and her thin lips were tightly closed in a way that did not look promising to those who desired information. With a conspicuous absence of tact or diplomacy, Mr. Benson asked her abruptly, "Did you write this paper?" "I did," said Cicely, and as soon as the words were uttered, her lips closed again with a snap. Her reply fell like a bombshell upon the breathless group of listeners. Tom Willard was the first to speak. "What!" he exclaimed. "Maddy didn't write that? You wrote it?" "Yes," asserted Cicely, looking Tom squarely in the eyes. "When did you write it?" asked the coroner. "A week or more ago." "Why did you write it?" "I refuse to tell." "Who is the S. mentioned in this paper?" "I refuse to tell." "You needn't tell. That is outside the case. It is sufficient for us to know that Miss Van Norman did not write this paper. If you wrote it, it has no bearing on the case. Your penmanship is very like hers." "I practice to make it so," said Cicely. "Miss Van Norman desired me to do so, that I might answer unimportant notes and sign her name to them. They were in no sense forgeries. Ladies frequently have their own names signed by their secretaries. Miss Van Norman often received notes like that." "Why did you not tell before that you wrote this paper supposed to have been written by Miss Van Norman?" "Nobody asked me." Miss Dupuy's tone was defiant and even pert. Robert Fessenden began to look at the girl with increasing interest. He felt quite sure that she knew more about the tragedy than he had expected. His detective instinct became immediately alert, and he glanced significantly at Kitty French. She was breathlessly watching Cicely, but nothing could be learned from the girl's inscrutable face, and to an attentive listener her very voice did not ring true. Dr. Leonard and Dr. Hills looked at each other. Both remembered that the night before Cicely had stealthily opened the door of the library and put her head in, but seeing them, had quickly gone back again. This information might or might not be of importance, but after a brief whispered conference, the two men concluded that it was not the time then to refer to it. Mr. Carleton, though still pale and haggard of face, seemed to have taken on new interest, and listened attentively to the conversation, while big, good-natured Tom Willard leaned forward and took the paper, and then sat studying it, with a perplexed expression. "But why did you not volunteer the information? You must have known it was of great importance." The coroner spoke almost petulantly, and indeed Miss Dupuy had suppressed important information. At his question she became greatly embarrassed. She blushed and looked down, and then, with an effort resuming her air of defiance, she snapped out her answer. "I was afraid." "Afraid of what?" "Afraid that they would think somebody killed Miss Van Norman instead of she killed herself, as she did." "How do you know she did?" "I don't know it, except that I left her here alone when I went to my room, and the house was all locked up, and soon after that she was found dead. So she must have killed herself." "Those conclusions," said the coroner pompously, "are for us to arrive at, not for you to declare. The case," he then said, turning toward the doctors and the young detective, "is entirely changed by the hearing of Miss Dupuy's testimony. The fact that the note was not written by Miss Van Norman will, I'm sure, remove from the minds of the doctors the possibility of suicide." "It certainly will," said Doctor Leonard. "I quite agree with Doctor Hills that except for the note all evidence is against the theory of suicide." "Then," went on Mr. Benson, "if it is not a suicide, Miss Van Norman must have been the victim of foul play, and it is our duty to investigate the matter and attempt to discover whose hand it was that wielded the fatal dagger." Mr. Benson was fond of high-sounding words and phrases, and, finding himself in charge of what promised to be a mysterious, if not a celebrated, case, he made the most of his authoritative position. Robert Fessenden paid little attention to the coroner's speech. His brain was working rapidly, and he was trying to piece together such data as he had already accumulated in the way of evidence. It was but little, to be sure, and in lieu of definite clues he allowed himself to speculate a little on the probabilities. But he realized that he was in the presence of a mysterious murder case, and he was more than willing to do anything he could toward discovering the truth of the matter. The known facts were so appalling, and any evidence of undiscovered facts was as yet so extremely slight, that Fessenden felt there was a great deal to be done. He was trying to collect and systematize his own small fund of information when he realized that the audience was being dismissed. Mr. Benson announced that he would convene a jury and hold an inquest that same afternoon, and then he would expect all those now present to return as witnesses. Without waiting to learn what the others did, Fessenden turned to Kitty French and asked her to go with him for a stroll. "You need fresh air," he said, as they stepped from the veranda, "but also I need you to talk to. I can formulate my ideas better if I express them aloud, and you are such a clear-headed and sympathetic listener that it helps a lot." Kitty smiled with pleasure at the compliment. Then her pretty face became grave again, as she remembered what must be the subject of their conversation. Before I talk to the lawyers or detectives who will doubtless soon infest the house, I want to straighten out my own ideas." "I don't see how you can have any," said Kitty. "I mean, of course, any definite ideas about who committed the murder." "I haven't really definite ones, but I want you to help me get some." "Well," said Kitty, looking provokingly lovely in her serious endeavor to be helpful, "let's sit down here and talk it over." "Here" was a sort of rustic arbor, which was a delightful place for a tête-à-tête, but not at all conducive to deep thought or profound conversation. "Go on," said Kitty, pursing her red lips and puckering her white brow in her determination to supply the help that was required of her. "But I can't go on if you look like that. All logic and deduction fly out of my head, and I can think only of poetry and romance. And it won't do. At least not now. Can't you give a more successful imitation of a coroner's jury?" Kitty tried to look stupid and wise both at once, and only succeeded in looking bewitching. "It's no use," said Fessenden. "I can't sit facing you as I would the real thing in the way of juries. So I'll sit beside you and look at the side of that distant barn while we talk." So he turned partly round, and fixing his gaze on the stolid red barn, said abruptly, "Who wrote that paper?" "I don't know," said Kitty, feeling that she couldn't help much here. "Somehow I can't seem to believe that Dupuy girl wrote it. She sounded to me like a lady reciting a fabrication." "I thought that too," said Kitty. "I never liked Cicely, because I never trusted her, but Maddy was very fond of her, and she wouldn't have been unless she had found Cicely trustworthy." "Come to luncheon, you two," said Tom Willard, as he approached the arbor. "Oh, Mr. Willard," said Kitty, "who do you think wrote that paper?" "Why, Miss Dupuy," said Tom, in surprise. "She owned up to it." "Yes, I know, but I'm not sure she told the truth." "I don't know why she shouldn't," said Tom, thoughtfully. And then he added gently, "And, after looking at it closely, I felt sure, myself, it wasn't Maddy's writing after all." "Then it must be Cicely's," said Kitty. "I admit I can't tell them apart." And then the three went back to the house. Chapter 9. The Will. Immediately after luncheon, Lawyer Peabody came. This gentleman had had charge of the Van Norman legal matters for many years, and it was known by most of those present that he was bringing with him such wills or other documents as might have a bearing on the present crisis. Mr. Peabody was an old man. Moreover, he had for many years been intimately associated with the Van Norman household, and had been a close friend of both Richard Van Norman and Madeleine. Shattered and broken by the sad tragedy in the household, he could scarcely repress his emotion when he undertook to address the little audience. But the main purport of his business there at that time was to announce the contents of the two wills in his possession. The first one, the will of Richard Van Norman, was no surprise to anyone present, except perhaps those few who did not live in Mapleton. One of these, Robert Fessenden, was extremely interested to learn that because of Madeleine's death before her marriage, and also before she was 23 years of age, the large fortune of Richard Van Norman, which would have been hers on her wedding day, passed at once and unrestrictedly to Tom Willard. but also by the terms of Richard Van Norman's will the fine old mansion and grounds and a sum of money, modest in comparison with the whole fortune, but ample to maintain the estate, were Madeleine's own, and had been from the day of her uncle's death. Possessed of this property, therefore, Madeleine had made a will which was dated a few months before her death, and which Mr. Peabody now read. After appropriate and substantial bequests to several intimate friends, to her housekeeper and secretary, and to all the servants, Madeleine devised that her residuary fortune and the Van Norman house and grounds should become the property of Miss Elizabeth Morton. This was a complete surprise to all, with the possible exception of Miss Morton herself. It was not easy to judge from her haughty and self-satisfied countenance whether she had known of this before or not. Fessenden, who was watching her closely, was inclined to think she had known of it, and again his busy imagination ran riot. The first point, he thought to himself, in discovering a potential murderer, is to inquire who will be benefited by the victim's death. Apparently the only ones to profit by the passing of Madeleine Van Norman were Tom Willard and Miss Morton. But even the ingenious imagination of the young detective balked at the idea of connecting either of these two with the tragedy. He knew Willard had not been in the house at the time of the murder, and Miss Morton, as he had chanced to discover, had occupied a room on the third floor. Moreover, it was absurd on the face of things to fancy a well-bred, middle-aged lady stealing downstairs at dead of night to kill her charming young hostess. It was with a sense of satisfaction, therefore, that Fessenden assured himself that he had formed no suspicion whatever, and could listen with a mind entirely unprejudiced to such evidence as the coroner's inquiry might bring forth. He was even glad that he had not discussed the matter further with Kitty French. He still thought she had clear vision and good judgment, but he had begun to realize that in her presence his own clearness of vision was dazzled by her dancing eyes and a certain distracting charm which he had never before observed in any woman. But he told himself somewhat sternly that feminine charm must not be allowed to interfere with the present business in hand, and he seated himself at a considerable distance from Kitty French when it was time for the inquest. A slight delay was occasioned by waiting for Coroner Benson's own stenographer, but when he arrived the inquiry was at once begun. At the request of Miss Morton, or it might rather be said at her command, the whole assembly had moved to the drawing-room, it being a much larger and more airy apartment, and withal less haunted by the picture of the tragedy itself. And yet to hold a coroner's inquiry in a room gay with wedding decorations was almost, if not quite, as ghastly. But Coroner Benson paid no heed to emotional considerations, and conducted himself with the same air of justice and legality as if he had been in a court-room or the town hall. As for the jury he had gathered, the half-dozen men, though filled with righteous indignation at the crime committed in their village, wasted no thought on the incongruity of their surroundings. Coroner Benson put his first question to Mrs. Markham, as he considered her, in a way at least, the present head of the household. To be sure, the house now legally belonged to Miss Morton, and that lady was quickly assuming an added air of importance, which was doubtless the result of her recent inheritance. But Mrs. Markham was still housekeeper, and by virtue of her long association with the place, Mr. Benson chose to treat her with exceeding courtesy and deference. But Mrs. Markham, though now quite composed and willing to answer questions, could give no evidence of any importance. She testified that she had seen Madeleine last at about 10 o'clock the night before. This was after the guests who had been at dinner had gone away, and the house guests had gone to their rooms. Miss Van Norman was alone in the library, and as Mrs. Markham left her, she asked her to send Cicely Dupuy to the library. Mrs. Markham had then gone directly to her own room, which was on the second floor, above the drawing room. It was at the front of the house, and the room behind it, also over the long drawing room, was the one now devoted to the exhibition of Madeleine's wedding gifts. Mrs. Markham had retired almost immediately, and had heard no unusual sounds. She explained, however, that she was somewhat deaf, and had there been any disturbance downstairs, it was by no means probable that she would have heard it. "What was the first intimation you had that anything had happened?" asked Mr. Benson. "Kitty French came to my door and called to me. Her excited voice made me think something was wrong, and, dressing hastily, I came downstairs, to find many of the household already assembled." "And then you went into the library?" "Yes. I had no idea Madeleine was dead. I thought she had fainted, and I went toward her at once." "Did you touch her?" "Yes, and I saw at once she was not living. But Miss Morton said perhaps she might be, and then she telephoned for Dr. Hills." "Can you tell me if the house is carefully locked at night?" "It is, I am sure, but it is not in my province to attend to it." "Whose duty is it?" "That of Harris, the butler." "Will you please call Harris at once?" Mr. Benson's tone of finality seemed to dismiss Mrs. Markham as a witness, and she rang the bell for the butler. Harris came in, a perfect specimen of that type of butler that is so similar to a certain type of bishop. Aside from the gravity of the occasion, he seemed to show a separate gravity of position, of importance, and of all-embracing knowledge. "Your name is Harris?" said Mr. Benson. "Yes, sir. James Harris, sir." "You have been employed in this house for some years?" 17 years and more, sir." "Is it your duty to lock up the house at night?" "It is, sir. Mr. Van Norman was most particular about it, sir, being as how the house is alone like in the grounds, and there being so much trees and shrubberies about." "There are strong bolts to doors and windows?" "Most especial strong, sir. It was Mr. Van Norman's wish to make it impossible for burglars to get in." "And did he succeed in this?" "He did, sir, for sure. There are patent locks on every door and window, more than one on most of them, and whenever Mr. Van Norman heard of a new kind of lock, he'd order it at once." "Is the house fitted with burglar alarms?" "No, sir. Mr. Van Norman depended on his safety locks and strong bolts. He said he didn't want no alarm, because it was forever getting out of kilter and bolts were surer after all." "And every night you make sure that these bolts and fastenings are all secured in place?" "I do, sir, and I have done it for many years." "You looked after them last night as usual?" "Sure, sir. Every one of them I attended to myself." "You can testify, then, that the house could not have been entered by a burglar last night?" asked Mr. Benson. "Not by a burglar, nor by anybody else, sir, unless they broke down a door or cut out a pane of glass." "Yet Mr. Carleton came in."
Harris looked annoyed.
"Of course, sir. Anybody could come in the front door with a latchkey. I didn't mean that they couldn't. But all the other doors and windows were fastened all right, and I found them all right this morning." "You made a careful examination of them?" "Yes, sir. Of course, we was all up through the night, and as soon as I learned that Miss Madeleine was gone, sir, I felt I ought to look about a bit, and everything was as right as could be, sir. No burglar was into this house last night, sir." "How about the cellar?" "We never bother much about the cellar, sir, as there's nothing down there to steal, unless they take the furnace or the gas meter. But the door at the top of the cellar stairs, as opens into the hall, sir, is locked every night with a double lock and bolt besides." "Then no burglar could come up through the cellar way?" "That he couldn't, sir, nor yet down through the skylight, for the skylight is bolted every night, same as the windows." "And the windows on the second floor, are they fastened at night?" "They are in the halls, sir, but of course in the bedrooms I don't know how they may be, that is, the occupied bedrooms. When the guest rooms are vacant, I always fasten those windows." "Then you can testify, Harris, that there was no way for any one to enter this house last night except at the front door with a latch key, or through the window of some occupied bedroom?" "I can swear to that, sir." "You are sure you've overlooked no way, no back window or seldom used door?" Harris was a little hurt at this insistent questioning, but the coroner recognized that this was a most important bit of evidence, and so pressed his questions. "I'm sure of it, sir. Mr. Van Norman taught me to be most thorough about this matter, and I've never done different since Miss Madeleine has been mistress here." "That is all. Thank you, Harris. You may go." Harris went away, his honest countenance showing a look of relief that his ordeal was over, and yet betokening a perplexed anxiety also. Cicely Dupuy was next called upon to give her evidence, or rather to continue the testimony which she had begun in the library. The girl had a pleasanter expression than she had shown at the previous questioning, but a red spot burned in either cheek, and she was clearly trying to be calm, though really under stress of a great excitement. "You were with Miss Van Norman in the library last evening?" began Mr. Benson, speaking more gently than he had been doing, for he feared an emotional outburst might again render this witness unavailable. "Yes," said Miss Dupuy in a low tone. "When Mrs. Markham came upstairs, she stopped at my door and said Miss Van Norman wanted me, and I went down immediately." "You have been Miss Van Norman's secretary for some time?" "For nearly 5 years." "What were your duties?" "I attended to her social correspondence, helped her with her accounts, both household and personal, read to her, and often did errands and made calls for her." "She was kind to you?" "She was more than kind. She treated me always as her social equal, and as her friend." Cicely's blue eyes filled with tears, and her voice quivered as she spoke this tribute to her employer. Again Mr. Benson feared she would break down, and changed his course of questioning. "At what time did you go to the library last evening?" "It could not have been more than a few minutes past 10." "What did you do there?" Miss Van Norman dictated some lists of matters to be attended to, and she discussed with me a few final arrangements for her wedding." "Did she seem about as usual in her manner?" "Yes, except that she was very tired, and seemed a little preoccupied." "And then she dismissed you?" "Yes, she told me to go to bed, and said that she should sit up for an hour or so, and would write some notes herself." "Apparently she did not do so, as no notes have been found in the library." "That must be so, sir." But as she said this, a change came over Miss Dupuy's face. She seemed to think that the absence of those notes was of startling importance, and though she tried not to show her agitation, it was clearly evident from the way she bit her lower lip and clenched her fingers. "At what time did Miss Van Norman dismiss you?" asked Mr. Benson, seeming to ignore her embarrassment. "At 10:30. "Did you retire at once?" "No. I had some notes to write for Miss Van Norman, and also some of my own, and I sat at my desk for some time. I don't know just how long." "And then what happened?" At this question, Cicely Dupuy became more nervous and embarrassed than ever. She hesitated, and then made 2 or 3 attempts to speak, each one of which resulted in no intelligible sound. Chapter 10. Some Testimony. "There is nothing to fear," said Mr. Benson kindly. "Simply tell us what you heard while sitting there writing that caused you to leave your room." Glancing around as if in search of someone, Cicely finally managed to make an audible reply. "I heard a loud cry," she said, "that sounded as if somebody were frightened or in danger. I naturally ran out into the hall, and looking over the baluster, I saw Mr. Carleton in the hall below. I felt sure then that it was he who had cried out, so I came downstairs." "At what time was this?" "At 11:30, exactly." "How do you know so accurately?" "Because, as I came downstairs, the old clock in the middle landing chimed the half hour. It has a deep, soft note, and it struck just as I passed the clock, and it startled me a little, so of course I remember it perfectly." "And then?" "And then—" Cicely again hesitated, but with a visible effort resumed her speech. "Why, and then I came on down, and found Mr. Carleton nearly distracted. I could not guess what was the matter. He was turning on the lights, and ringing the servants' bells, and acting like a man beside himself. Then in a moment Marie appeared, and gave one of her French shrieks that completely upset what little nerve I had left." "And what did you do next?" I went into the library." "Why?" Cicely looked up suddenly, as if startled, but after only an instant's hesitation, replied, "Because Mr. Carleton pointed toward the doorway, and Marie and I went in together." "You knew at once that Miss Van Norman was not alive?" "I was not sure, but Marie went toward her, and then turned away with another of her horrid screams, and I felt that Miss Van Norman must be dead." "What did Mr. Carleton say?" "He said nothing. He pointed to the written paper on the table." "Which you had written yourself?" "Yes, but he didn't know that." Cicely spoke eagerly, as if saying something of importance. "He thought she wrote it." "Never mind that point for the moment. But I must now ask you to explain that written message which you have declared that you yourself wrote." At this Cicely's manner changed. She became again the obstinate and defiant woman who had answered the coroner's earlier questions. "I refuse to explain it." "Consider a moment," said Mr. Benson quietly. "Sooner or later, perhaps at a trial, you will be obliged to explain this matter. How much better, then, to confide in us now, and perhaps lead to an immediate solution of the mystery." Cicely pondered a moment, then she said, "I have nothing to conceal. I will tell you. I did write that paper, and it was the confession of my heart. I am very miserable, and when I wrote it I quite intended to take my own life. When I was called to go to Miss Van Norman in the library, I gathered up some notes and lists from my desk to take to her. In my haste I must have included that paper without knowing it, for when I reached my room I could not find it. And then when I saw it, there on the table, Cicely had again grown nervous and excited. Her voice trembled, her eyes filled with tears, and fearing a nervous collapse, Mr. Benson hurried on to other questions. "Whom does that S in your note stand for?" "That I shall never tell." The determination in her voice convinced him that it was useless to insist on that point, so the coroner went on. "Perhaps we have no right to ask. Now you must tell me some other things, and believe me, my questions are not prompted by curiosity, but are necessary to the discovery of the truth. Why did Mr. Carleton point to that paper?" He seemed so shocked and stunned that he was almost unable to speak. I suppose he thought that would explain why she had killed herself." "But she hadn't killed herself." "But he thought she had, and he thought that paper proved it." "But why had he need to prove it, and to you?" "I don't know. I don't know what he thought. I don't know what I thought myself after I reached the library door and looked in and saw that dreadful sight. Oh, I shall see it all my life." At the memory, Cicely broke down again and sank into her chair, shaking with convulsive sobs. Mr. Benson did not disturb her further, but proceeded to question the others. The account of Marie, the maid, merely served to corroborate what Cicely had said. Marie, too, had heard Carleton's cry for help, and throwing on a dressing gown, had run downstairs to Madeleine's room. Not finding her mistress there, she had hurried down to the first floor, reaching the lower hall but a few minutes after Cicely did. She said also that it was just about 11:30 by the clock in her own room when she heard Mr. Carleton's cry. "You knew who it was that had called out so loudly?" asked Mr. Benson. "No, monsieur. I heard only the shriek, as of one in great disaster. I ran to Miss Van Norman's room, as that was my first duty." "Were you not in attendance upon her?" "No, she had sent me the message by Miss Dupuy that I need not attend her when she retired." "Did this often occur?" "Not often, but sometimes when Miss Van Norman sat up late, by herself, she would excuse me at an earlier hour. She was most kind and considerate of everybody." "Then when at last you saw Miss Van Norman in the library, what did you do?" "Mon Dieu, I shrieked. Why not? I was amazed, shocked, but above all desolated. It was a cruel scene. I knew not what to do, so naturally I shrieked." Marie's French shrug almost convinced her hearers that truly that was the only thing to do on such an occasion. "And now," said Coroner Benson, "can you tell us of anything any incident or any knowledge of your own that will throw any light on this whole matter?" Marie's pretty face took on a strange expression. It was not fear or terror, but a sort of perplexity. She gave a furtive glance at Mr. Carleton and then at Miss Morton, and hesitated. At last she spoke slowly. "If monsieur could perhaps word his question a little differently, with more of a definiteness—" "Very well. Do you know anything of Miss Van Norman's private affairs that would assist us in discovering who killed her?" "No, monsieur," said Marie promptly, with a look of relief. "Did Miss Van Norman ever, in the slightest way, express any intentions or desire to end her life?" "Never, monsieur." "Do you think she was glad and happy in the knowledge of her fast approaching wedding day?" "I am sure of it," and Marie's tone was that of one who well knew whereof she spoke. "That is all, then, for the present," and Marie, with another sidelong, curious glance at Miss Morton, resumed her seat. Kitty French and Molly Gardner were questioned, but they told nothing that would throw any light on the matter. They had heard the cry, and while hastily dressing had heard the general commotion in the house. They had thought it must be a fire, and not until they reached the library did they know what had really happened. "And then," said Kitty indignantly, in conclusion of her own recital, "we were not allowed to stay with the others, but were sent to our rooms. So how can we give any evidence?" It was plain to be seen. Miss French felt herself defrauded of an opportunity that should have been hers. But Miss Gardner was of quite a different mind. She answered in whispered monosyllables the questions put by the coroner, and as she knew no more than Kitty of the whole matter, she was not questioned much. Robert Fessenden smiled a little at the different attitudes of the two girls. He knew Kitty was eager to hear all the exciting details, while Molly shrank from the whole subject. However, as they were such minor witnesses, the coroner paid little serious attention to them or to their statements. Miss Morton's testimony came next. Fessenden regarded her with interest, as, composed and calm, she waited the coroner's interrogations. She was deliberate and careful in making her replies, and it seemed to the young detective as if she knew nothing whatever about the whole affair, but was trying to imply that she knew a great deal. "You went to your room when the others did, at about 10 o'clock?" asked Mr. Benson. "Yes, but I did not retire at once." "Did you hear any sounds that caused you alarm?" "No, not alarm. Curiosity, perhaps, but that is surely pardonable to a naturally timid woman in a strange house." "Then did you hear sounds? Can you describe them?" "I do not think they were other than those made by the servants attending to their duties. But the putting on of coal or the fastening of windows are noticeable sounds when one is not accustomed to them." "You could discern, then, that it was the shoveling of coal or the fastening of windows that you heard?" "No, I could not. My hearing is extremely acute, but as my room is on the 3rd floor, all the sounds I hear were faint and muffled." "Did you hear Mr. Carleton's cry for help?" "I did, but at that instant it did not sound loud. However, I was sufficiently alarmed to open my door and step out into the hall. I had not taken off my evening gown, and, seeing bright lights downstairs, of course I immediately went down. The household was nearly all assembled when I reached the library. I saw at once what had happened, And I saw, too, that Mrs. Markham and the younger women were quite frantic with fright and excitement. I thought it my duty, therefore, to take up the reins of government, and I took the liberty of telephoning for the doctor. I think there is nothing more of importance that I can tell you." At this Fessenden barely repressed a smile, for he could not see that Miss Morton had told anything of importance at all. "I would like," said Mr. Benson, "for you to inform us as to your relations with the Van Norman household. Have you been long acquainted with Miss Van Norman?" "About 2 years," replied Miss Morton, with a snapping together of her teeth, which was one of her many peculiarities of manner. "And how did the acquaintance come about?" "Her uncle and I were friends many years ago," said Miss Morton. "I knew Richard Van Norman before Madeleine was born. We quarreled, and I never saw him again. After his death, Madeleine wrote to me, and several letters passed between us. At her invitation, I made a short visit here about a year ago. Again, at her invitation, I came here yesterday to be present at her wedding." Miss Morton's manner, though quiet, betokened repressed excitement rather than suppressed emotion. In no way did her hard, bright eyes show grief or sorrow, but they flashed in a way that indicated high nervous pressure. "Did you know that you were to inherit this house and a large sum of money at Miss Van Norman's death?" The question was thrown at her so suddenly that Miss Morton almost gasped. She hesitated for an appreciable instant, then with a sudden snap of her strong, angular jaws, she said, "No." "You had no intimation of it whatever?" "No." Again that excessive decision of manner, which to Fessenden's mind, at least, stultified rather than corroborated the verity of her statement. But Coroner Benson expressed no doubt of his witness, but merely said casually, "Yet on the occasion of the tragedy last night, you at once assumed the attitude of the head of the house. You gave orders to the servants, you took up the reins of management, and seemed to anticipate the fact that the house was eventually to be your own." Miss Morton looked aghast. If one chose to think so, she looked as if detected in a false statement. Glancing around the room, she saw the eyes of Kitty French and of Marie, the maid, intently fixed on her. This seemed to unnerve her, and in a broken, trembling voice, almost a whine, she said, "If I did so, it was only with a helpful motive. Mrs. Markham was so collapsed with the shock she had just sustained that she was really incapable of giving orders. If I did so, it was only from the desire to be of service." This seemed indeed plausible, and the most casual observer would know that Miss Morton's helpfulness could only be accomplished in a peremptory and dictatorial manner. "Will you tell us why Miss Van Norman chose to leave you so large a bequest, when she had known you so slightly?" asked Mr. Benson. Fessenden thought Miss Morton would resent this question, but instead she answered, willingly enough, "Because she knew that except for my unfortunate quarrel with Richard Van Norman many years ago, the place would have been mine anyway." "You mean you were to have married Mr. Van Norman?" "I mean just that." Miss Morton looked a little defiant, but also an air of pride tinged her statement, and she seemed to be asserting her lifelong right to the property. "Miss Van Norman, then, knew of your friendship with her uncle and the reason of its cessation?" "She learned of it about 2 years ago." "How?" "By finding some letters of mine among Mr. Van Norman's papers, shortly after his death." And in consequence of that discovery, she willed you this house at her death?" "Yes. That is, I suppose she must have done so, as she did so will it." "But you did not know of it, and the reading of the will was to you a surprise?" "Yes," declared Miss Morton, and though the coroner then dismissed her without comment on her statements, there were several present who did not believe the lady spoke veraciously. Tom Willard was called next, and Fessenden wondered what would be the testimony of a man who had not arrived on the scene until more than 2 hours after the deed was done. And indeed, there was little that Tom could say. Mr. Benson asked him to detail his own movements after he left the house the night before. "There's little to tell," said Tom, "but I'll try to be exact. I went away from this house about 10 o'clock, taking with me a suitcase full of clothes. I went directly to the Mapleton Inn, and although I don't know exactly, I should say I must have reached there in something less than 10 minutes. Then I went to the office of the establishment, registered, and asked for a room. The proprietor gave me a good enough room, a bellboy picked up my bag, and I went to my room at once." "And remained there?" "Yes. Later I rang for some ice water, which the same boy brought to me. Directly after that I turned in. I slept soundly until awakened by a knocking at my door at about 2 o'clock in the morning." "The message from this house?" "Yes. The landlord himself stood there when I opened the door, and told me I was wanted on the telephone. When I went to the telephone, I heard Miss Morton's voice, and she asked me to come over here. I came as quickly as possible, and—" Tom's voice broke at this point, and feeling that his story was finished, Mr. Benson considerately asked him no further questions. Chapter 11. I Decline to Say. Schuyler Carleton was questioned next. When Mr. Benson asked him to tell his story, he hesitated, and finally said that he would prefer to have the coroner ask direct questions, which he would answer. "Did you go away from this house with the other guests at about 10 o'clock last evening?" "No, I was not here at dinner. I left at about 5:30 in the afternoon." "Where did you go?" "I went directly home, and remained there until late in the evening." "Mr. Fessenden was with you?" "He was with us at dinner. He is staying at my house, as he was invited to be best man at the wedding." Though this statement came calmly from Carleton's lips, it was evident to all that he fully appreciated the tragic picture it suggested. "He was with you through the evening?" "Part of the time. He went early to his room, saying he had some business to attend to." "Why were you two not here to dinner with Miss Van Norman?" Fessenden looked up, surprised at this question. Surely Mr. Benson had gathered odd bits of information since morning. Schuyler Carleton looked stern. "I did not come because I did not wish to. Mr. Fessenden remained with me, saying he did not care to attend the dinner unless I did." Carleton looked casually at Fessenden as he said this, and though there was no question in the glance, Rob nodded his head in corroboration of the witness. "You spent the entire evening at home, then?" "Yes, until a late hour." "And then?" "I returned here between 11 and 12 o'clock." "To make a call?" "No, I came upon an errand." "What was the errand?" "As it has no bearing upon the case, I think it is my privilege to decline to answer." You entered the house with a latchkey." "I did." "Is that latchkey your own property?" "For the time, yes. Mrs. Markham gave it to me a few days ago, for my convenience, because I have occasion to come to the house so frequently." "Was it your intention when you went away in the afternoon to return later?" "It was." "Upon this secret errand?" "Yes." "Did you expect to see Miss Van Norman when you entered the house with the latchkey?" "I did not." "And when you entered, you discovered the tragedy in the library?" Schuyler Carleton hesitated. His dry lips quivered, and his whole frame shook with intense emotion. "Yes," he stammered. But the mere fact of that hesitation instantly kindled a spark of suspicion in the minds of some of his hearers. Until that moment, Carleton's excessive agitation had been attributed entirely to his grief at the awful fate which had come to his fiancée. But now, all at once, the man's demeanor gave an impression of something else. Could it be guilt? Fessenden looked at his friend curiously. In his mind, however, no slightest suspicion was aroused, but he wondered what it was that Carleton was keeping back. Surely the man must know that to make any mystery about his call at the Van Norman mansion the night before was to invite immediate and justifiable suspicion. The court had instructed the district attorney to be present at the inquest, and though that unobtrusive gentleman had taken notes, and otherwise shown a quiet interest in the proceedings, he now awakened to a more alert manner, and leaned forward to get a better look at the white, set face of the witness. Carleton looked like a marble image. His refined patrician features seemed even handsomer for their haggard agony. Surely he was in no way responsible for the awful deed that had been done, and yet just as surely he was possessed of some awful secret fear which kept every nerve strained and tense. Endeavoring not to exhibit the surprise and dismay which he felt, Coroner Benson continued his questions. "And then, when you discovered Miss Van Norman, what did you do?" Carleton passed his hand across his white brow. "I hardly know," he said. "I was stunned, dazed. I went toward her, and seeing the dagger on the floor, I picked it up mechanically, scarcely knowing what I did. I felt intuitively that the girl was dead, but I did not touch her, and, not knowing what else to do, I cried out for help." "And turned on the lights?" "I pushed several electric buttons, not knowing which were lights and which bells. My principal idea was to arouse the inmates of the house at once." "Who first appeared in answer to your call?" "Miss Dupuy came running downstairs at once, followed by Miss Van Norman's maid." "And then you pointed to the paper that lay on the table near Miss Van Norman's hand?" "Yes. I could not speak, and I thought that would tell Miss Dupuy that Miss Van Norman had taken her own life." "You thought, then, that Miss Van Norman wrote the message?" "I thought so then, and I think so now." This, of course, produced a sensation, but it was only evidenced by a deeper silence on the part of the startled audience. "But Miss Dupuy asserts that she wrote it," said the coroner. To this Schuyler Carleton merely gave a slight bow of his handsome head, but it said as plainly as words that his belief was not altered by Miss Dupuy's assertion. "Granting for the moment, then," went on Mr. Benson, "that Miss Van Norman did write it, is the message intelligible to you?" "Intelligible, yes," said Carleton, but, as I have said before, inexplicable." This ambiguous speech meant little to most of the listeners, but it seemed to give Robert Fessenden food for thought, and he looked at Carleton with a new wonder in his eyes. "Mr. Carleton," said the coroner, with a note of gravity in his voice, "I think it my duty to tell you that your own interests require you to state the nature of your errand to this house last night." "I decline to do so." "Then will you state as exactly as you can the hour at which you entered the front door?" "I don't know precisely, but Miss Dupuy has testified that she came downstairs in response to my call at 11:30. I came into the house a few moments before." "That is all," said the coroner abruptly. "Mr. Hunt, if you please." The man from headquarters, who had guarded the present room through the night, came in from the doorway where he had been standing. "Will you tell what you know concerning Mr. Carleton's entrance last night?" said the coroner briefly. "I was on guard in the present room from 9 o'clock on," said Mr. Hunt. "Of course I was on the watch out for anything unusual, and alert to hear any sound. I heard the company go away at 10 o'clock. I heard most of the people in the house go to their rooms right after that. I heard and I also saw Miss Dupuy go down to the library after that, and return to her room at about 10:30. I noticed all these things because that is my business, but they made no special impression on me, as they were but the natural proceedings of the people who belonged here. Of course I was only on the lookout for intruders. I heard the sound of a latch key, and I heard the front door open at exactly 11:15. I stepped out into the hall, and, looking downstairs, I saw Mr. Carleton enter. I also saw Miss Dupuy in the upper hall, looking over the banister. She too must have seen Mr. Carleton. But as all of this was none of my business, and as nobody had entered who hadn't a right to, I simply returned to my post. At 11:30 I heard Mr. Carleton's cry, and saw the lights go up all over the house. Anything more, sir?" "Not at present, Mr. Hunt. Miss Dupuy, did you hear Mr. Carleton come in?" Cicely Dupuy turned an angry face toward Mr. Hunt, and fairly glared at the mild-mannered man. She waited a moment before answering the coroner's question, and then, as if with a sudden resolve, she spoke a sharp, quick "Yes." "And that was at 11:15?" "It was later," declared Cicely, "for Mr. Carleton told you himself that he went directly into the library as soon as he came into the house, and as I heard his cry at 11:30, he must have entered only a few moments before." Schuyler Carleton stared at Cicely, and she returned his gaze. His face was absolutely inscrutable, a pallid mask that might have concealed emotion of any sort. But there was a suggestion of fear in the strange eyes as they gazed at Cicely, and though it was quickly suppressed, it had been noted by those most interested. The girl looked straight at him, with determination written in every line of her face. It was quite evident to the onlookers that a mental message was passing between these two. "You are sure, Mr. Hunt, that your statement as to the time is correct?" said the coroner, turning again to him. "Perfectly sure, sir. It is my business to be sure of the time." "Mr. Carleton," said Mr. Benson, "there is an apparent discrepancy here, which it is advisable for you to explain. If you came into this house at 11:15, and rang the bells for help at 11:30, what were you doing in the meantime?" It was out at last. The coroner's question, though quietly put, was equivalent to an accusation. Every eye in the room was turned toward Carleton, and every ear waited in suspense for his reply. At last the answer came. The dazed, uncertain look had returned to Carleton's face, and his voice sounded mechanical, like that of an automaton, as he replied, "I decline to say." "I think, Mr. Carleton, you can scarcely realize the gravity of the moment, or the mistake you are making in refusing to answer this question." "I have nothing to say," repeated Carleton, and his pallor changed to a faint, angry flush of red. "I am sorry," said Mr. Benson gently. He seemed to have lost his pompous manner in his genuine anxiety for his witness, and he looked sorrowfully at Carleton's impassive yet stubborn face. "As so much hinges on the question of who wrote that paper," he resumed, "I will make a test now that ought to convince us all. Miss Dupuy, you say you wrote it, I believe." "I did, yes, sir," said Cicely, stammering a little now, though she had been calm enough a few minutes before. "Then you know the words on the paper, by rote?" "Yes, sir," said Cicely, uncertain of where this was leading. "I will ask you, then, to take this paper and pencil, your own pencil, and write the same words in the same way once more." "Oh, don't ask me to do that," implored Cicely, clasping her hands and looking very distressed. "I not only ask you, but I direct you to do it, and do it at once." An attendant handed pencil and paper to Cicely, and after a glance at Carleton, who did not meet it, she began to write. Though evidently agitated, she wrote clearly and evenly, and the paper she handed to Coroner Benson a moment later was practically an exact duplicate of the one found on the library table. "It does not require a handwriting expert," said the coroner, "to declare that these two papers were written by the same hand. The penmanship is indeed similar to Miss Van Norman's, of whose writing I have here many specimens, but it is only similar. It is by no means identical. You may all examine these at your leisure, and can only agree to what I say." The district attorney, who had been comparing the papers, laid them down with an air of finality that proved his agreement with the statements made. "And so," went on Mr. Benson, "granting as we must that Miss Dupuy wrote the paper, we have nothing whatever to indicate that this case is a suicide. We are therefore seeking a murderer, and our most earnest efforts must be made to that end. I trust, Mr. Carleton, now that you can no longer think Miss Van Norman wrote the message, that you will aid us in our work by stating frankly how you were occupied during that quarter hour which elapsed between your entering the house and your raising the alarm." But Carleton preserved his stony calm. "There was no quarter hour," he said. "I may have stepped into the drawing room a moment before going to the library, but I gave the alarm almost immediately on entering the house. Certainly immediately on my discovery of the scene in the library." Cicely looked defiantly at Mr. Hunt, who, in his turn, looked perplexed. The man had no wish to insinuate anything against Mr. Carleton, but, as he had said, it was his business to know the time, and he knew that Mr. Carleton came into the house at 11:15, and not at 11:30. The pause that followed was broken by Coroner Benson's voice. "There is nothing more to be done at present. The inquest is adjourned until tomorrow afternoon. But we have discovered that there has been a crime committed. There is no doubt that Miss Van Norman was murdered, and that the crime took place between 10:30 and 11:30 last night. It is our duty to spare no effort to discover the criminal. As an audience, you are now dismissed." End of Chapter 11. Chapter 12. Dorothy Burt. The people rose slowly from their chairs, and most of them looked as if they did not quite comprehend what it all meant. Among these was Carleton himself. He seemed oblivious to the fact that he was, at least tacitly, an accused man, and stood quietly, as if awaiting any further developments that might come. "Look at Schuyler," said Kitty French to Fessenden. The two had withdrawn to a quiet corner to discuss the affair, but Kitty was doing most of the talking, while Fessenden was quiet and seemed preoccupied. "Of course, I suppose he must have killed Madeleine," went on Kitty. "But it's so hard to believe it, after all. I've tried to think of a reason for it, and this is the only one I can think of. They quarreled yesterday afternoon, and he went away in a huff. I believe he came back last night to make it up with her, and then they quarreled again, and he stabbed her." Fessenden looked at her thoughtfully. "I think that Hunt man testified accurately," he said, "and if so, Carleton was in the house just 15 minutes before he gave the alarm. Now, 15 minutes is an awfully short time to quarrel with anybody so desperately that it leads to a murder." "That's true, but they both have very quick tempers. At least Madeleine had. She didn't often do it, but when she did fly into a fury, it was as quick as a flash. I've never seen Mr. Carleton angry, but I know he can be, for Maddy told me so." "Still, a quarter of an hour is too short a time for a fatal quarrel, I think. If Carleton killed her, he came here for that purpose, and it was done premeditatedly." "Why do you say 'if he killed her'? It's been proved she didn't kill herself. It's been proved that no one could enter the house without a latchkey, and it's been proved that the deed was done in that 1 hour between 10:30 and 11:30. So it had to be Mr. Carleton." "Miss French, you have a logical mind, and I think you'd make a clever little detective, but you have overlooked the possibility that she was killed by someone in the house." "Some of us?" Kitty's look of amazement almost made Fessenden smile. "Not you or Miss Gardner," he said, "but a burglar might have been concealed in the house." "I never thought of that!" exclaimed Kitty, her eyes opening wide at the thought. "Why, he might have killed us all." "It isn't a very plausible theory," said Fessenden, unheeding the girl's remark, "and yet I could think of nothing else. Every instinct of my mind denies Carleton's guilt. Why, he isn't that sort of a man." "Perhaps he isn't as good as he looks," said Kitty, wagging her head wisely. "I know a lot about him, and you know he wasn't a bit in love with Maddy." "You hinted that before. And was he really a mere fortune hunter? I can't believe that of Carleton. I've known the man for years." "He must have been, or why else did he marry her? He's in love with another girl." "He is? Who?" "I don't know who, but Madeleine hinted it to me only a few days ago. It made her miserable. And that's why everybody thought she wrote that paper that said, 'I love S, but he does not love me.'" And you don't know who this rival is? No, but I know what she's like. She's the clinging rosebud effect. What do you mean? Just that. You know Madeleine was a big, grand, splendid type, majestic and haughty, and she thought Schuyler loved better some little timid girl who would sort of look up to him and need his protection. Fessenden looked steadily at Miss French. "Are you imagining all this?" he said, "or is it true?" "Both," responded Kitty, with a charming little smile. "Maddy just hinted it to me, and I guessed the rest. You know, I have detective instinct, too, as well as you." "You have indeed," and Rob gave an admiring glance to the pouting red lips and roguish eyes. "But tell me more about it." "There isn't much to tell," said Kitty, looking thoughtful, "but there's a lot to deduce." "Well, tell me what there is to tell, and then we'll both deduce." It pleased Kitty greatly to imagine she was really helping Fessenden, and she went glibly on. "Why, you see, Maddy was unhappy, we all know that, and it was for some reason connected with Schuyler. Yet they were to be married all the same. But sometimes Maddy had asked me, with such a wistful look, if I didn't think men preferred little kittenish girls to big proud ones like herself." "And you, being a little kittenish girl, said yes?" "Don't be rude," said Kitty, flashing a smile at him. "I am kittenish in name only, and I am not little." "You are, compared to Miss Van Norman's type." "Oh, yes, she was like a beautiful Amazon. Well, she either had reason to think, or she imagined, that Schuyler pretended to love her, and was really in love with some dear little clinging rosebud." "Clinging rosebud! What an absurd expression! And yet, by Jove, it just fits her. And Miss Van Norman said to me, oh, I say, Miss French, don't you know who the rosebud is?" "No," said Kitty, wondering at his sudden look of dismay. "Well, I do. Oh, this is getting dreadful. Come outside with me, and let's look into this idea. I hope it's only an idea." Throwing a soft, fawn-colored cape around her, and drawing its pink-lined hood over her curly hair, Kitty went with Fessenden out on the lawn and down to the little arbor where they had sat before. "Did you ever hear of Dorothy Burt?" he asked, almost in a whisper. "No. Who is she?" "Well, she's your clinging rosebud, I'm sure of it, and I'll tell you why." "First tell me who she is." "She's Mrs. Carleton's companion. Schuyler's mother, you know. She lives in the Carleton household, and she is the sweetest, prettiest, shyest little thing you ever saw. Clinging rosebud just fits her." "Indeed!" said Kitty, who had suddenly lost interest in the conversation. And, indeed, few girls of Kitty's disposition would have enjoyed this enthusiastic eulogy of another. "I don't admire that sort myself," went on Rob, who was tactfully observant. "I like a little more spirit and vivacity." Kitty beamed once more. "But she's a wonder of her own class. I was there at dinner last night, you know, and I saw her for the first time, and though I thought nothing of it at the time, I can look back now and see that she adores Schuyler. Why, she scarcely took her eyes off him at dinner, and she ate next to nothing. Poor little girl, I believe she was awfully cut up at his approaching marriage." "And what was Schuyler's attitude toward her?" Kitty was interested enough now. Fessenden looked very grave, and was silent for a time. "It's a beastly thing to say," he observed at last, "but if Schuyler had been in love with that girl, and wanted to conceal the fact, he couldn't have acted differently from the way he did act." "Was he kind to her?" "Yes, kind, but with a restrained air, as if he felt it his duty to show indifference toward her." "Was she with you after dinner?" Fessenden thought. "I went to my room early, and Mrs. Carleton had then already excused herself. Yes, I left Schuyler and Miss Burt in the drawing room, and later I saw them from my window, strolling through the rose garden." "On his wedding eve!" exclaimed Kitty, with a look akin to horror in her eyes. "Yes, and I thought nothing of it, for I simply assumed that he was devoted to Miss Van Norman, and was merely pleasant to his mother's companion. But, in view of something Miss Van Norman said to me yesterday—can it be it was only yesterday?—the matter becomes serious." "What did she say?" "It seems like betraying a confidence, and yet it isn't, for we must discover if it means anything. But she said to me with real agitation, 'Do you know Dorothy Burt?' At that time I hadn't met Miss Burt, and had never heard of her, so I said, 'No, who is she?' 'Nobody,' said Miss Van Norman, 'less than nobody. Never mention her to me again.' Her voice, even more than her words, betokened grief and even anger, so of course the subject was dropped. But doesn't that prove her anxious about the girl, if not really jealous?" "Of course it does," said Kitty. "I know that's the one that has been troubling Madeleine. Oh, how dreadful it all is!" "And then, too," Fessenden said, still reminiscently, "Miss Van Norman said she wanted to go away from Mapleton immediately after her wedding, and never return here again." "Did she say that? Then, of course, it was only so that Schuyler should never see the Burt girl again. Poor dear Maddy, she was so proud, and so self-contained. But how she must have suffered! You see, she knew Schuyler admired her and respected her and all that, and she must have thought that, once removed from the presence of the Rosebud girl, he would forget her. But I can't understand old Schuyler marrying Miss Van Norman if he didn't truly love her. You know, Miss French, that man and I have been staunch friends for years, and though I rarely see him, I know his honorable nature, and I can't believe he would marry one woman while loving another." "He didn't," said Kitty in a meaning voice that expressed far more than the words signified. Fessenden drew back in horror. "Don't!" he cried. "You can't mean that Schuyler put Miss Van Norman out of the way to clear the path for Miss Burt?" "I don't mean anything," said Kitty, rather contradictorily. "But, as I said, Maddy was not killed by any one inside the house, I'm sure of that, and no one from outside could get in, except Schuyler, and he had a motive. Don't you always, in detective work, look for the motive?" "Yes, but this is too horrible." "All murders are too horrible. But I tell you it must have been Schuyler. It couldn't have been Miss Burt." "Don't be absurd. That little girl couldn't kill a fly, I'm sure. I wish you could see her, Miss French. Then you'd understand how her very contrast to Miss Van Norman's splendid beauty would fascinate Schuyler. And I know he was fascinated. I saw it in his repressed manner last evening, though I didn't realize it then as I do now." "I have a theory," said Kitty slowly. "You know Mr. Carleton went away yesterday afternoon rather angry at Maddy." She had carried her flirtation with Tom a little too far, and Mr. Carleton resented it. I don't blame him. The very day before the wedding. But it was partly his fault, too. Well, suppose he went home, rather upset over the quarrel, and then seeing Miss Burt and her probably mild, angelic ways, I'm sure she has them, suppose he wished he could be off with Maddy and marry Miss Burt instead. But he wouldn't kill his fiancée if he did think that. Wait a minute. Then suppose after the evening in the rose garden with the gentle, clinging little girl, he concluded he never could be happy with Maddy, and suppose he came at 11 o'clock, or whatever time it was, to tell her so and to ask her to set him free. On the eve of the wedding day? With the house already in gala dress for the ceremony? Yes. Suppose the very nearness of the ceremony made it seem to him impossible to go through with it. Well? Well, and then suppose he did ask Madeleine to free him, and suppose she refused. And she would refuse. I know her nature well enough to know she never would give him up to the other girl if she could help it. And then suppose, when she refused to free him, you know he has a fearfully quick temper, and that awful paper cutter lay right there handy, suppose he stabbed her in a moment of desperate anger. "I can't think it," said Rob after a pause. "I've tried, and I can't. But suppose all you say is true as far as this. Suppose he asked her to free him because he loved another, and suppose she was so grieved and mortified at this that in her own sudden fit of angry jealousy, you know she had a quick temper also, suppose she picked up the dagger and turned it upon herself, as she had sometimes said she would do." Kitty listened attentively. "It might be so," she said slowly. "You may be nearer the truth than I. But I do believe that one of us must be right. Of course, this leaves the written paper out of the question entirely." "That written paper hasn't been thoroughly explained yet," exclaimed the young man. "Now, look here, Miss French, I'm not going to wait to be officially employed on this case, though I am going to offer Carleton my legal services, but I mean to do a little investigating on my own account. The sooner inquiries are made, the more information is usually obtained. Can you arrange that I shall have an interview with Miss Dupuy?" "I think I can," said Kitty. "But if you let it appear that you're inquisitive, she won't tell you a thing. Suppose we just talk to her casually, you and I. I won't bother you." "Indeed you won't. You'll be of first-class help. When can we see her?" While they had been talking, other things had been happening in the drawing-room. The people who had been gathered there had all disappeared, and under the active superintendence of Miss Morton, the florist's men who had put up the decorations were now taking them away. The whole room was in confusion, and Kitty and Mr. Fessenden were glad to escape to some more habitable place. "Wait here," said Kitty, as they passed through the hall, "and I'll be back in a moment." Kitty flew upstairs and soon returned, saying that Miss Dupuy would be glad to talk with them both in Madeleine's sitting room. End of chapter 12.